Daniel Brooks dropped to his knees on the cold hospital floor, not to clean it. To save a man's life, his hands moved with the kind of precision you only see in operating rooms. Commands left his mouth before he even realized he was speaking. And for 30 seconds, every doctor in that hallway stood frozen, watching a janitor do what they couldn't. Then the supervisor grabbed his arm. "You clean floors. You don't give orders." Daniel stood up slowly, looked the man dead in the eyes, and said 7 words that would bring this entire hospital to its knees. What city are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this hit different for you, subscribe and hit that bell because we're just getting started. The mop hit the floor at 6:47 in the morning. That was Daniel Brooks' quiet, deliberate, starting his shift 13 minutes early, the way he always did, because he'd learned long ago that the first hour of any institution's day told you everything you needed to know about how it really worked. Not the polished version they showed regulators. Not the rehearsed language in the mission statement framed above the reception desk. The real version. The raw version. The version nobody bothered to hide because the people watching were only janitors. He pushed the mop bucket down the east wing hallway of Green Valley Regional Hospital, and the wheels squeaked against the freshly waxed linoleum in a rhythm that had become over 3 weeks almost like music to him. Almost. If music could be a reminder of everything wrong with a place, Green Valley Regional was one of the largest medical centers in Ohio. 12 floors, 432 beds, a trauma center rated level 2, a cardiac unit that had been featured in 3 separate healthcare publications in the last 18 months. The hospital's website called it a beacon of compassionate care for the communities of Central Ohio. Daniel had read that phrase the night before his first shift. He'd read it sitting at his kitchen table, coffee going cold beside him, his 8-year-old daughter Lily asleep upstairs, and he'd thought, I hope you're right. I genuinely hope you're right. He was not 3 weeks later convinced that they were. He wrung out the mop near the nurses' station on the East Wing's 2nd floor and watched the morning handoff beginning to happen around him. Night shift nurses passing charts to day shift. The low voices, the exhausted eyes. The particular kind of tired that only comes from watching people suffer through the small hours of the morning. A nurse named Patricia, older, heavy-set reading glasses, perched at the end of her nose, slapped a folder against the counter without looking up. Mr. Hendricks in 214 complained about his pain medication timing again, 3rd night in a row. The day shift nurse, younger, scrolling through something on a tablet, didn't look up either. Chart it. I did chart it. Then what do you want me to do about it, Pat? A pause. I want you to look at it. The younger nurse finally looked up. Pat, I've got 11 patients on my list and 2 call-outs this morning. I will get to Mr. Hendricks. Patricia picked up her bag. She looked at Daniel without really seeing him. Then she walked away. Daniel looked at the closed door of room 214. He kept mopping. The thing about wearing a gray uniform and pushing a cleaning cart was this. You became part of the architecture. People didn't look at you the way they looked at each other. They looked through you, around you, past you, the way you look past a fire extinguisher on the wall or a trash can near an elevator. Functional. Necessary. Not worth attention. Daniel had understood this intellectually before he accepted the assignment. He hadn't understood it in his chest until he lived it. The State Health Oversight Board had come to him 4 weeks ago through a contact. He trusted a woman named Dr. Margaret O.C., who had been his supervisor during his years as a healthcare quality director, and who had, over the course of a single dinner, laid out what they knew and what they needed. We've been receiving complaints, she told him, pouring water into her glass without looking at him. Credible ones, multiple sources, different departments. The pattern is consistent enough that we can't write it off as personnel conflicts or individual bad actors. What's the pattern? Unequal care. Systematic. The hospital's internal numbers look clean because they've learned how to make internal numbers look clean. But the complaints are describing something that doesn't match those numbers at all. Daniel had turned his fork over in his hand. How bad? Margaret had looked at him then. Really looked at him. A man died, she said quietly. 71 years old. No insurance. Admitted through the ER on a Thursday evening, triaged at level 3, placed in the waiting area. He sat there for 4 hours, Daniel. 4 hours. And somewhere in that waiting room with chest pain, he had described twice to staff members who marked it as stable. He had a massive cardiac event and died before anyone ran a full EKG. The fork stopped moving. And the official report, Daniel asked, says the triage assessment was appropriate given available information at time of presentation. She set down her glass. Which is technically true. Which is also, we believe, a profoundly incomplete version of what actually happened and why. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. You want me to go in? I want you to go in as someone who will be ignored completely, Margaret said. Because whoever you are when you walk in that building, the way they treat you will tell us more about this hospital than any chart audit ever could. You want me to go in as a janitor? The janitorial staffing agency we use for placements already has a slot. You'd be a fill-in through a contractor. No hospital employee would have reason to look into your background beyond the basics. Daniel thought about Lily. About the permission slips on the refrigerator and the parent-teacher conference he'd already rescheduled twice. He thought about a man named Howard Greer, age 71, who had sat in a waiting room with chest pain and been invisible until it was too late. He thought about his wife Claire. He said yes. That had been 23 days ago. In 23 days. Daniel Brooks had learned the layout of Green Valley Regional Hospital better than most people who'd worked there for years. He knew which hallways connected where. He knew the rhythms of each shift. He knew where conversations happened that weren't meant to be overheard, and he knew because people didn't hide things from janitors exactly who was talking about what. He kept a mental log. Every night after Lily was in bed, he wrote it down. The elderly woman in the oncology wing, whose family had been waiting 3 days for a care conference that kept being rescheduled. The young father in the ER, who had been passed between 2 departments for a billing question until he'd finally given up and left without being seen. The uninsured patient in room 308, whose discharge had been expedited so fast that the home care instructions he'd been given were for a completely different condition. Daniel wrote it all down. He wrote it down because he needed facts, not feelings. Because feelings wouldn't hold up in a report. Because the board needed documentation, not outrage. But he felt the outrage anyway. Every single day. The moment that had almost broken his discipline happened on day 11. He'd been cleaning the family waiting room on the 3rd floor, the one outside the cardiac unit, when he noticed a man sitting alone in the corner. Not the healthy kind of alone where someone is scrolling their phone and enjoying the quiet. The desperate kind of alone. The kind where a person has run out of things to do with their hands. The man was maybe 60, weathered face. Work jacket, the kind with a company logo on the chest faded from washing. His name embroidered in red thread on the pocket was Roy. Roy was staring at the floor. Daniel kept cleaning. He moved the cart closer to that side of the room. He didn't look directly at Roy. He just stayed nearby the way you stay near someone when you don't know what else to do. After a while, Roy looked up. You know anything about how long it takes to get someone admitted? Roy asked. Not demanding, just asking. The way a man asks a question when he's already certain the answer won't be good. Daniel straightened up. Depends on a lot of things. What's going on? My wife. Roy's jaw tightened. She's been in the ER for 6 hours. They keep saying someone's coming to talk to us. Nobody's coming to talk to us. Did you ask at the front desk? 3 times. Roy shook his head. First time they said they'd check. Second time they said she was being evaluated. Third time the woman looked at me like I was asking her for something she didn't have. Daniel set the mop against the wall. He knew professionally that he should not intervene directly. He knew that he was here to observe, document, and report, not to insert himself into individual situations in ways that might compromise the investigation or his cover. He also knew that Roy was sitting alone in a waiting room 6 hours in, and nobody had come to tell him anything. What's your wife's name? Roy blinked, like he hadn't expected the question. Sandra. Okay. Daniel picked up his cart. I'll see what I can find out. He found out plenty. Sandra Roy. Sandra Kowalski, actually 62 years old, had been triaged correctly and placed in an ER bay after about 40 minutes, which was within acceptable parameters. The delay wasn't in her care. The delay was in the communication. Nobody had updated the family waiting area because the ER coordinator responsible for family communication had been pulled to help with a critical patient in a different bay, and the task had been handed off to a nursing student who hadn't understood that it was her responsibility now. A system failure. Not malice. Just a breakdown in accountability that left a man named Roy staring at a floor for 6 hours while his wife was technically being taken care of 50 feet away. Daniel found a charge nurse named Karen, a capable woman in her 40s, with the no-nonsense energy of someone who had been running emergency departments for 15 years. "There's a family in the third-floor waiting area," Daniel said. He'd approached her the way he'd learned to approach people in this hospital quietly, without demanding attention, with the mild apologetic posture of a man who knows he might be interrupting. "Husband of a patient named Kowalski. He hasn't been updated in 6 hours." Karen stopped walking. Looked at him. Not threw him at him. "Who dropped the ball on family communication?" Sounds like the handoff when Martinez pulled Chen to Bay 4. Karen's expression sharpened. 6 hours. Since about 8 this morning. She was already walking toward the ER. "I'll handle it." She did. Within 15 minutes, Roy was being brought back to see Sandra. Daniel watched from the hallway as the man stood up from his chair, slowly, stiffly, like someone who'd been holding himself together through sheer will, and followed a nurse through the double doors. Roy didn't see Daniel. Probably wouldn't have recognized him if he had. But Daniel saw Roy's shoulders drop the moment those doors opened. The way a body releases the weight of fear when it finally gets permission to breathe. Daniel stood there for a moment after they disappeared. Then he picked up his cart and went back to work. He thought about Claire on the drive home that night. He always thought about Claire on the drive home. It was the one time of day when the forward motion of the car and the dark outside the windows and Lily asleep in the back seat created a kind of enclosed silence where memories could surface without him having the will to push them back down. Claire had been 34. She'd been healthy, running 3 times a week, cooking the kind of food that made Lily groan and Daniel secretly proud, laughing at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She'd gone into Valley Presbyterian for what should have been a routine procedure. A laparoscopic surgery. 90-minute operation. She'd be home for dinner. She wasn't home for dinner. She wasn't home ever again. The mistake that killed her wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines. It was paperwork. A medication allergy that had been logged in the wrong field in an electronic record system, flagged by a nurse who mentioned it to a resident who intended to pass it on and didn't. A reaction that should have been anticipated and wasn't. A response that should have been faster and wasn't. Daniel had been a healthcare quality director at the time. He'd built patient safety systems. He'd written policies. He'd given presentations at conferences about the importance of communication redundancy in clinical environments. He'd never used any of it to save his wife because nobody told him she needed saving until it was far too late. After Claire, he couldn't go back to the conference rooms. He couldn't go back to the PowerPoints. He couldn't sit in another meeting with hospital executives talking about improving error rates by 2.3% and feel like that number was connected to anything real. He left. Took Lily to his parents' house in Columbus for a month. Came back to a quieter life, a smaller life work that kept his hands busy without requiring him to pretend that systems were saving people when sometimes systems were the thing that failed them. Margaret Osei had found him 4 years later. He'd said no 3 times before he said yes. He said yes because of Howard Greer. 71 years old. Chest pain. 4 hours in a waiting room. Dead. If there was something broken in that hospital that he could see and document and hand to people who could fix it, then he had no right to say no. Whatever the cost to his quiet life. Whatever the disruption to Lily's school schedule. Whatever it meant to walk back into the world he'd left. He didn't have the right to look away. Day 14. Daniel was cleaning the administrative hallway on the 5th floor when he heard the voices through the partially open door of a conference room. He slowed down. He wasn't trying to eavesdrop. He was trying to clean that section of hallway, and the door was open, and voices carry. That was what he would have said if anyone asked. He would have been telling the truth. The voices belonged to 3 people. The hospital's CFO, a man named Gerald Fitch, who Daniel had seen precisely twice, and who seemed to move through the hospital in a bubble of expensive cologne and calculated indifference. The director of patient services, a woman named Roberta Huang, and someone Daniel didn't recognize who kept referring to the hospital's Q-score metrics. "The Medicaid patient volume is dragging our satisfaction scores again," Fitch was saying. His voice had the kind of smoothness that comes from years of saying things that should sound alarming, but being trained to say them like they're just data. The feedback loops from that population skew negative regardless of care quality. They're more likely to report dissatisfaction. "That's not necessarily a care quality issue," Huang said. She sounded cautious, like someone who knew which battles to pick. "It's a metric issue," Fitch replied. "And our metrics affect our rankings, and our rankings affect our contracts, and our contracts affect our revenue. So yes, Roberta, it matters." "What are you suggesting?" A pause. "I'm suggesting we look at wait time management on the uninsured and Medicaid side more strategically. If someone isn't going to generate a meaningful return on bed utilization, we need to think carefully about how we're allocating resources." Silence. Then Huang quieter. "Gerald, it's operational efficiency," Fitch said. Flat, certain, like a man who'd had this conversation before and knew how it ended. "It's how we stay solvent so we can serve the patients we can actually serve. You want to have this argument, or you want to help me figure out how to make the numbers work?" Silence again. Then the unknown voice. The Q-score person jumped in with something about patient flow algorithms, and Daniel pushed the mop bucket slowly past the door and kept going. He kept his face neutral, but his jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. Day 17. The extortion. He almost missed it. He was restocking the cleaning supply closet near the main ER entrance when a man came in from the parking lot, rain-soaked, moving with the frantic urgency of someone running toward something terrible. Mid-40s construction worker billed the look of a man who hadn't slept and knew he was about to have to fight. He went straight to the ER reception window. The woman behind the glass. Her name tag said. Deb had the practiced blankness of someone who had been trained to be a wall. "My wife," the man said. "Maria Delgado. She was brought in this morning. I need to know, are you immediate family? She's my wife. I need to see identification." He produced a driver's license so fast it clattered against the glass partition. Deb picked it up, looked at it, typed something. "Mrs. Delgado is being evaluated. For what? What's wrong with her, is she?" "Sir, I can't share medical information through this window. If you take a seat, a staff member will come. I've been waiting for 3 hours." The man's voice broke at the edges. Not in anger, in fear. The kind of fear that makes a person's voice sound like something is fraying inside them. "Please. Her sister called me at 6 in the morning. She collapsed at home. I drove straight from the job site. I have been in that waiting room for 3 hours, and nobody has told me anything. Please, she's my wife." Deb's expression didn't change. "Sir, I understand this is difficult. If you return to the waiting." "Is there anything I can do?" the man asked. He was trying to hold himself together, visibly effortfully trying. "Anything at all. There's nothing I can do. I'll do anything. Whatever it takes. Just..." Deb glanced to her left. Just slightly. Involuntary, like a reflex. Daniel followed her eyeline. There was a man standing at the far end of the reception area. He wasn't staff, not exactly. He wore a hospital lanyard, but no uniform. The kind of administrative ambiguity that could mean half a dozen things. He was watching the conversation at the window with the attentive stillness of someone who knew when he was being cued. Deb looked back at the man, Mr. Delgado, and said very quietly, "There are sometimes people who can help with the process. Help things move a little faster. That gentleman over there." A gesture so subtle, it was almost nothing. He sometimes knows how to navigate things. Daniel set down the supply box he was carrying. He watched. The non-staff man with the lanyard walked slowly toward Mr. Delgado, with the ease of someone making a casual crossing of the room. He put a hand briefly on Mr. Delgado's shoulder. They spoke too quietly for Daniel to hear. Mr. Delgado nodded. His hand went to his jacket pocket. Daniel turned and walked to the supply room, closed the door behind him, stood in the dark for a moment. Then he took out the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket and wrote down everything. The time, the names he knew, the ones he didn't, what he'd seen, what he'd inferred. He wrote for 3 minutes without stopping. When he was done, he looked at what he'd written, and he thought, "This is why I'm here." Day 20. Emily Carter. He'd noticed her in his first week, but hadn't understood yet what he was looking at. She was young, late 20s, maybe 30. The kind of young where you still make rookie mistakes, but you care so much that the mistakes get corrected before they turn into something worse. She worked the overnight shift on the oncology floor and frequently showed up for the first hour of day shift anyway, which Daniel initially assumed was overtime, but eventually understood was voluntary. She stayed because there was always someone who needed her. On day 12, he'd seen her sitting on the floor of the hallway outside a patient's room at 7 in the morning, talking to an elderly woman through the open doorway. Not holding her hand. Not doing anything clinical. Just talking. The woman whose chart Daniel had glanced at when nobody was looking. 78 years old, late-stage lung cancer, no immediate family listed, was telling Emily about her garden. Tomatoes and zucchini, and something she called those useless decorative cabbages my neighbor keeps planting. Emily was laughing, genuinely laughing, on the floor, after a 12-hour shift. On day 16, Daniel had seen Emily argue. That was different. The argument was with the physician, a senior physician, Dr. Castellano, who had the departmental authority and the ego that often came paired with it. The argument was about a patient named Marcus Webb, 44 years old, uninsured, admitted for complications from unmanaged diabetes. Marcus had been on the floor for 8 days. Dr. Castellano had cleared him for discharge that morning. Emily disagreed. "His blood sugar is still unstable," she said. She was standing in the hallway outside the nurse's station, holding Marcus's chart, the way you hold something you're not going to let go of. "He doesn't have a primary care doctor. He doesn't have the medication supplies at home. If we discharge him today, he's going to be back in this ER in 2 weeks. He's medically stable for discharge," Dr. Castellano said. He said it the way senior physicians sometimes say things, with the impatience of a man who has made the decision and is now just waiting for the conversation to end. "Medically stable by the minimum criteria," Emily said. She didn't flinch. "Not realistically stable for the environment he's going home to." "Nurse Carter, I appreciate your concern, but the determination of discharge readiness is not." "I know it's not mine to make," Emily said. "I'm asking you to reconsider it. He needs 1 more day. He needs a social work consult and a prescription assistance referral and someone to explain to him how to use the glucometer, because nobody has done that yet in 8 days. A pause. Dr. Castellano looked at her. "Get social work in today," he said. "If they sign off on home readiness, he's discharged tomorrow." He walked away. Emily exhaled slowly, turned around, and saw Daniel watching. For a moment, they looked at each other. The nurse and the janitor, in the particular way of 2 people who have just witnessed something honest in a place that doesn't always allow for honesty. "Good morning," Daniel said. "Good morning," Emily said. She went back to work. Day 20. Dr. James Wilson. Daniel found him at 6:30 in the morning in the hospital's small chapel, which technically opened at 7, but which Daniel had learned the chaplain left unlocked, because Dr. Wilson came early, and the chaplain believed correctly that a man who needed the room before 7 in the morning probably needed it. Daniel wasn't supposed to be cleaning the chapel until 8. He went at 6:30 by accident. His cart had drifted that way when he was thinking about something else, and pushed open the door to find Dr. Wilson sitting in one of the pews, not praying exactly, just sitting. staring at the small wooden cross at the front of the room with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. Wilson was maybe 50, African American. A cardiologist who had trained at Johns Hopkins and had, according to hospital gossip, Daniel had absorbed, like everything else, turned down positions at 3 better-resourced institutions to stay at Green Valley because he'd grown up in this neighborhood. Daniel started to back out of the doorway. "You can come in," Wilson said without turning around. Daniel came in. Started the quiet, careful work of cleaning that you do when someone else is in the room and you want to take up as little space as possible. After a while, Wilson spoke again. "Do you think people generally try to do right?" Daniel kept wiping the baseboards. "Most people." "Most." "Yeah." Wilson nodded slowly. "I keep telling myself that. Most people. Most people in this building are trying to do right." He paused. "And then some days, I watch what happens, and I think I might be using the word most too generously." Daniel sat back on his heels. "What happened?" Wilson was quiet for a moment. Then, "Patient of mine. Came in through the ER 2 weeks ago. 63, uninsured former smoker, never had a cardiologist because he couldn't afford one. Classic presentation for significant arterial disease. He needed a cardiac catheterization. He needed it promptly. And I requested the procedure. And the request went to the Utilization Review Committee. And the committee looked at his insurance status or lack thereof, and the request came back with a recommendation to explore outpatient management options first." Wilson's voice stayed level. Professional. Like a man who had trained himself to report facts without letting his voice break. Outpatient management options. For a man who didn't have a primary care doctor, who couldn't afford the medications that would constitute outpatient management, who lived 40 minutes from the nearest clinic that accepted uninsured patients. "What did you do?" "I went back to the committee, twice. The second time I brought the literature. I brought 3 separate studies on outcomes for delayed intervention in patients with his profile." He paused. "Third request was approved. He had the cath last Thursday." "Good," Daniel said. "Good," Wilson agreed. "Except he should have had it 14 days earlier, and I shouldn't have needed 3 requests and clinical literature citations to get a necessary procedure approved for a patient who happened not to have an insurance card." He looked at his hands. "I'm tired is what I'm telling you. I'm tired of fighting the system to do the job the system is supposed to let me do." Daniel looked at him for a moment. "You're still fighting," Daniel said. Wilson looked at him. "That matters," Daniel said simply, and went back to cleaning. On day 21, his last night before everything changed, Daniel sat at his kitchen table at 11 o'clock and looked at his notebook. 47 pages. Names, dates, conversations, observations, incidents documented with timestamps, patterns traced across departments. A picture assembled piece by piece of a hospital that had 2 faces, the public one clean and charitable and compassionate in all its literature, and the private one that Daniel had been watching for 3 weeks from the floor level, where the dirt nobody wanted to admit existed collected in the corners. He was ready. The board meeting was in 2 days. He looked at the notebook. Then he looked up at the ceiling. Then quietly in the empty kitchen where his daughter was asleep upstairs, and the refrigerator hummed, and the coffee maker ticked as it cooled. He thought about Roy's shoulders dropping as those doors finally opened. He thought about Emily arguing in a hallway for a man nobody else was fighting for. He thought about James Wilson exhausted and early in a chapel asking if people generally tried to do right. He thought about Howard Greer, 71 years old, sitting in a waiting room. He closed the notebook. Day 22, he wrote on the inside back cover. "Let's find out how this ends." I didn't know yet. That day 22 wouldn't go the way anyone planned. That before the board meeting. Before the suit and the conference room and the folder placed on the table. Something would happen in a hospital hallway that would change everything. Something that a janitor would have to handle alone, while everyone watched. Day 22 began the way catastrophe usually does, quietly without warning in the middle of something ordinary. Daniel was on the third floor at 7:14 in the morning, running a damp cloth along the handrail near the elevator bank when he heard the sound. Not a dramatic sound. Not the kind of sound that appears in movies right before something terrible happens with swelling music and a close-up on someone's face registering dread. It was a small sound. A single sharp exhale like someone trying to speak and finding no air to do it with. Then the softer sound of a body making contact with the floor. He turned around. The man on the floor was maybe 65. Silver hair. Business clothes, not the kind of executive that Gerald Fitch wore, but the decent kind. The kind a man puts on when he wants to feel prepared for the day. He was on his side with one arm partially extended, the way a person lands when they go down fast and their reflexes only half catch them. His color was wrong. The gray-blue around his lips was the kind of color that strips everything else away and leaves only urgency. Daniel was moving before the thought finished forming. He covered the distance in 4 steps and was down beside the man before anyone else in the hallway had processed what was happening. He put 2 fingers to the man's carotid. Faint. Irregular. Not absent, but working too hard and too uncertainly. "Sir," Daniel said. Clear voice. The kind of voice you use when you need someone to locate themselves. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes moved. Not focused, but moving. "Sir, I need you to stay with me. Can you squeeze my hand?" A tremor in the man's fingers. "Bear. Somebody call a code?" Daniel was already repositioning. Not shouting, projecting. The trained difference between the two. "I needed a crash cart, and I need a physician on the 3rd floor elevator bank right now." A nurse at the far end of the hallway turned, froze for exactly 1 second, then moved. Daniel loosened the man's collar, checked his airway, tilted the chin, watched the chest. Shallow movement, inconsistent, the chest wall working against itself. A medical student, young, probably 24, still wearing the fresh anxiety of someone in their first clinical rotation, came around the corner at a near run and stopped when she saw Daniel. She looked at the man on the floor. She looked at the janitor, crouched beside him, with 2 fingers on the pulse point. "What's his, should I—" "What's your name?" Daniel said. Not unkindly, cut through the paralysis. "Sarah. Sarah Ewan. Sarah. Go to the nurses' station. Tell them I need a 12-lead EKG cart at this location, and I need it in the next 2 minutes. Can you do that?" "Yes." She went. A nurse arrived first. Daniel recognized her, a day shift RN named Carla, who worked the 3rd floor and was one of the competent ones. She took one look at Daniel's hands on the patient and started to reach for him. "Sir, please step back. His pulse is irregular and dropping," Daniel said. He didn't move. "Possible cardiac event. He needs the cart and he needs a physician. Is there a cardiologist on the floor?" Carla's eyes sharpened. She was taking in information, the patient's color. Daniel's hands, the quality of the information she'd just been given. Something shifted in her face. "Dr. Wilson is on this floor," she said. 1208. "Get him." She got on the radio. The man on the floor made a sound. Not words, something below words. The kind of sound a person makes when they're fighting their way back from somewhere very dark. His hand found Daniel's arm and gripped it. Weak grip. Desperate grip. "Hey," Daniel said. Quietly now. Just to him. "I've got you. You hear me? I've got you. Help is coming. Stay with me." The grip tightened. 47 seconds later. James Wilson came around the corner at a walk that was almost a run, the efficient, controlled urgency of a cardiologist who has learned that running creates panic and panic kills people. He saw the patient. He saw Daniel. He clocked the positioning, the airway management, the 2-finger pulse check that Daniel was still maintaining. He said nothing about the fact that it was the janitor doing it. He just dropped down on the other side and said, "Talk to me." "Male approximately 60 to 65, Daniel said. "Went down approximately 90 seconds ago. Loss of consciousness partial. Pulse irregular, dropping. Color indicates possible hypoxia. No chest compressions indicated yet, but we're close." Wilson looked at him directly for exactly 1 second. Then, Carla, where's my crash cart? Coming. Carla called from the nurse's station. EKG's right behind it. Get me oxygen. Wilson was already checking the airway. And get me a second line in case we need to push. Another nurse arrived at a run. Then something happened that Daniel had half expected and fully dreaded. A voice came from behind him, authoritative, and edged with the particular irritation of a man who has decided he is in charge before he has taken in enough information to know what is actually happening. What is going on here? Daniel knew the voice. Richard Harmon, supervisor of patient services, 5th floor. The man moved through the hospital with the specific energy of someone who had been given a title and interpreted it as permission. Daniel had noted him in his observations as a subject of particular concern, not because Harmon was malicious exactly, but because he was the most dangerous kind of institutional creature, someone who understood the rules deeply enough to weaponize them. There's a patient down, Daniel said without turning around. Suspected cardiac event. Why is who authorized you to Daniel? You are a janitorial staff member. Harmon's voice tightened. He stepped forward. You cannot be administering care to a patient. Step back immediately. This is a liability. He's maintaining airway and monitoring pulse, Wilson said. His voice was crisp and final. Do not interrupt this. A beat. Dr. Wilson. Harmon started the hospital's protocol for non-clinical personnel. Harmon. Wilson did not look up. My patient. My call. Get back. Harmon got back. The crash cart arrived. The EKG cart arrived 30 seconds behind it. The man on the floor, whose wallet discovered by Carla, identified him as Thomas Edward Greer. Age 67, was being connected to leads when his grip on Daniel's arm went slack and his eyes closed fully. He's losing consciousness, Daniel said. I see it. Wilson had the paddles ready. Carla charged to 200. Daniel moved back 2 inches. Exactly 2. Enough to clear the field without leaving the man's side. The team worked. 4 minutes later, Thomas Greer had a rhythm. Not a perfect rhythm, but a present one. A heart that had decided under considerable pressure to keep going. Wilson sat back on his heels. He exhaled through his nose. The slow exhale of someone releasing 4 minutes of total focus. He looked at Daniel. Not through him. At him. That airway positioning you were holding, Wilson said. Where'd you learn that? Experience, Daniel said. Wilson held his gaze for a moment. Then the gurney arrived and Thomas Greer was moved and the hallway became a controlled, organized scene instead of a crisis. And Daniel picked up his cleaning cloth from where he'd dropped it on the floor. Harmon was still standing at the edge of the hallway. He stepped forward again. And the thing about Harmon was that he was not a stupid man, which made what he said next worse not better, because he must have known exactly what he was doing. Daniel, he said. His voice had lowered, but it hadn't softened. It had taken on the particular register that authority uses when it wants to reassert itself after being publicly overridden. What you did just now, the instructions you gave, the way you positioned yourself in that situation. I need you to understand that you significantly overstepped your role. Daniel picked up his mop. He looked at Harmon the way a man looks at something he has completely understood. He's alive, Daniel said. That's not. He's alive, Daniel said again. Quiet, simple. Whatever comes next, that's the thing that happened today. He went down, and he's alive. He looked at Harmon with the steady patience of someone who has decided not to be angry when anger is exactly what the situation could justify. Is there something else? Harmon's jaw moved. Daniel waited. Harmon walked away. Daniel watched him go. Then he said to no one in particular, to the empty hallway and the memory of a man's grip on his arm, not today, and he went back to work. He cleaned that hallway for the next 20 minutes. Methodically. Without rushing. The way you work when you need your hands busy, because your mind is processing something that your body hasn't finished responding to yet. His pulse had been elevated. He was aware of it the entire time. The physiological acknowledgement of what had just happened, and it came down slowly, the way it always does. The way you learn to manage it when you've spent years in clinical environments, where the cost of being undone by your own adrenaline is measured in outcomes. He thought about Thomas Greer's hand on his arm. That grip. He thought about Richard Harmon's voice. You significantly overstepped your role. He thought about James Wilson's face when he'd said, "Talk to me," and just accepted the information without questioning where it was coming from. The thing about James Wilson. Daniel had decided over the last several days was that Wilson was the kind of doctor the whole system was designed to wear down. He cared too specifically. He fought too persistently. He was too honest about what he was seeing in a place that preferred its physicians to be skilled and not inconvenient. And people like Wilson in institutions like this one either got ground down until they stopped fighting, or they got out. Unless something changed the institution first. Daniel wrung out the mop. Tomorrow was the board meeting. 24 hours. I thought about his notebook. 47 pages. Every pattern documented. Every incident timed. Every voice logged. Not a case built from one conversation, or one incident, or one afternoon in a hallway. A case built from 3 weeks of existing in the space where the hospital didn't perform for anyone, because the only person watching was the man with the cleaning cart. He thought about Gerald Fitch's voice through the conference room door. Outpatient management option, said with the smooth certainty of a man who had never once connected that phrase to a specific human being lying in a specific bed. He thought about the man with the lanyard. The barely there gesture from Deb at the reception window. Mr. Delgado's hand going to his jacket pocket. He thought about the elderly woman whose care conference had been rescheduled 3 times. I thought about Marcus Webb. 44 years old, diabetic, discharged too fast until Emily Carter decided he wasn't going to be. He thought about Howard Greer. 71. Chest pain. 4 hours. He put the mop back in the bucket and pushed the cart toward the service elevator. 24 hours. The elevator opened. He got in. The doors closed. He stood alone in the small metal box between floors, and for just a moment, he let the weight of it land. All of it 3 weeks of watching and listening and writing it down. 3 weeks of being invisible, while something unjust happened around him. 3 weeks of knowing and waiting and keeping his face neutral when every instinct in him wanted to stand up and say, "This is not acceptable, and I can prove it, and something is going to change." He breathed. The elevator reached the basement. He pushed the cart out and got back to work. He got home at 3:45. Lily was at school until 4:15, which meant he had 30 minutes, and he used 20 of them sitting at the kitchen table drinking a glass of water and staring at the wall. The way a person stares at a wall. When they're not looking at it, they're looking at something inside it. Then he got up and went to the closet in the hallway where he kept the box. The box was not dramatic. It was a standard banker's box, the kind you buy at an office supply store. It held the professional documentation of a career, not the awards, not the certificates. Those were in a different box, in a different closet. This box held the working documentation, the reports he'd written, the frameworks he'd built, the correspondence with state and federal oversight bodies, the testimonies he'd given, the policies he'd helped author. The documentation of a man who had spent 15 years learning how hospitals worked and how they failed and how sometimes you could reach inside the mechanism and fix something before it broke someone. He opened the box. He had a suit at the back of his closet, navy blue. He'd bought it 3 years ago for a medical conference he'd been invited to as an observer, not a speaker, just an observer, because he wasn't ready to come back as anything more than that, and he'd worn it once and hung it back up. He took it out, hung it on the door. He looked at it for a moment. The gray uniform was in the bathroom, hanging on the hook behind the door where he'd left it this morning. He thought about Thomas Greer's hand on his arm. He thought about Richard Harmon's voice. You clean floors. You don't give orders." He almost smiled. I went to the kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began composing the preliminary report he would hand-deliver to the board tomorrow morning. He had already prepared the structure. Now it was the matter of language, not inflammatory, not prosecutorial precise. The kind of language that doesn't give anyone a place to argue with the presentation, only the substance. I was still typing when the front door opened, and Lily came in, dropping her backpack in the hallway with the particular boneless abandon of a child who has been holding it together all day and is finally home. Dad. Kitchen. She appeared in the doorway, 8 years old, with Claire's eyes and Daniel's serious brow and the particular expression of a child who has something to say but is deciding whether to say it. "You're home early." 30 minutes, Daniel said. "And you're home exactly on time, so let's not make it weird." Lily sat down at the table. She looked at his laptop. She looked at him. "You're doing the work thing," she said. "I'm doing a work thing, yes." "The important work thing." He looked at her. "Why do you say important?" She shrugged. The particular 8-year-old shrug that means I know more than I'm saying, and I'm choosing how much to share. "Because you look the way you look when something matters." Daniel closed the laptop halfway. He looked at his daughter, who had her mother's eyes and would probably someday have her mother's terrifying capacity for reading people. "It matters," he said. "Yeah." "Is it going to be okay?" I thought about that for a moment. Really thought about it, because she was 8, and she deserved a real answer, not a reassuring one. "I think so," he said. "I think something's going to change. That's not always comfortable, but it's usually better than nothing changing." Lily considered this with the deliberate seriousness she brought to most things. "Okay," she said. She got up, went to the refrigerator, and started making a snack with the focused industry of someone who has accepted the terms and moved on to more pressing matters. Daniel opened the laptop. He kept writing. At 9:40 that night, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A number he didn't recognize, but a Columbus area code. He answered. "Daniel Brooks." A woman's voice. Careful. Professional. But with an edge underneath it, the edge of someone who is calling because they've decided they have to, not because they want to. "Speaking," Daniel said. "My name is Roberta Huang. I'm the Director of Patient Services at Green Valley Regional Hospital." Daniel said nothing. "I know who you are," Huang said. "Not who you've been presenting as. I know your actual background. I did some checking after what happened in the hallway today. The way you handled that patient." A pause. "The way you talked to Dr. Wilson." Daniel kept his voice level. "What can I do for you, Ms. Huang?" "I want you to know," she said. And there was something in her voice that took him a moment to identify, not anxiety, not anger. Something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a particular weight for a long time. "I want you to know that I am aware that what you've been observing does not reflect what I believe this hospital should be." Silence. "I've been trying," she said. "I want that on record. Whatever happens tomorrow. I have been raising these issues internally for 14 months. "I believe you," Daniel said. A beat. She hadn't expected that. "You do." "I've been watching for 3 weeks," Daniel said. "I've been watching everyone. You're on the right side of this, Ms. Huang. The issue is whether you've been able to act on it." A long silence. "Not enough," she said. Finally, honestly. "Not nearly enough. That's what tomorrow is for," Daniel said. Another silence. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "Or Dr. Brooks. What do I—" "Daniel is fine." "Daniel." She paused. "The board is expecting a routine review presentation. They are not expecting you." "I know. Gerald Fitch is going to be in that room." "I know that too. He has allies, and a very particular relationship with the board chair that gives him—" "Ms. Huang," Daniel said, "I have 47 pages of documentation. I have dates, times, names, and patterns that I observed directly over 3 weeks as a person this hospital treated as beneath their attention. I have the incident tonight on record. I have a name. Howard Greer, 71 years old, who died in your ER waiting room 14 months ago. And I have the discrepancy between the official report and the actual timeline of that evening, documented in detail." The silence on the other end of the line was a different kind of silence now. "I'm not asking this board to destroy this hospital," Daniel continued. "I'm asking them to fix it. Those are different requests, and I intend to make both of them very clearly." Huang was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I'll be in the room tomorrow." "Good," Daniel said. "I'll have my 14 months of internal documentation." "Bring it." Another pause. "Is there anything you need from me tonight?" Daniel looked across the kitchen at the navy suit hanging on the closet door. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He ended the call. He sat for a moment. Then he went back to the laptop and finished the report. He printed it at 11:15 p.m., 31 pages. He paper-clipped it with the precision of a man who has learned that the way you present information tells people something about how seriously you take it. He stacked it on top of the notebook. He looked at both of them. Then he closed the laptop, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs to check on Lily. She was asleep on her side, one arm around the stuffed bear that she was technically too old for, but which remained in her bed with the permanent tenure of something that had never been asked to leave. Her breathing was slow and even. The particular peace of a child who has decided the world is basically manageable. Daniel stood in the doorway. He thought about standing in a hallway with a mop invisible. He thought about Thomas Greer's hand on his arm. He thought about Howard Greer. Two Greers. No relation. Just the particular dark mathematics of a system that loses people. It doesn't fight hard enough to keep. He thought about James Wilson in a chapel before 7 in the morning, asking a janitor if people generally tried to do right. He thought about Emily Carter arguing in a hallway for a man nobody else was fighting for. He thought about Claire. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Then he said very quietly to the sleeping child, to whoever or whatever might be listening in the dark tomorrow. And he went to bed. And for the first time in 3 weeks, he slept without dreaming. Because there was nothing left to plan. Only the morning. He woke at 5:30 without an alarm. That was the thing about years of clinical training. Your body learned to treat certain mornings differently. It recognized the weight of what was coming before your conscious mind finished assembling it, and it pulled you upright before the day had fully begun, already running, already preparing. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 60 seconds. He counted them. An old habit from the years when 60 seconds of stillness before a difficult day was the only buffer he allowed himself between sleep and everything the world was about to demand. Then he got up. Hanimata coffee. He made Lily's lunch. Peanut butter no jelly apple slices. The small note he wrote every day on a folded square of paper and tucked inside. Today's note said, "You're the best thing I ever did. Have a good Thursday." He folded it. Put it next to the sandwich. He showered. He shaved with the kind of care a man brings to something that matters not, vanity precision. Then he stood in front of the closet and looked at the navy suit. He put it on slowly. He hadn't worn it in 3 years. It still fit, which surprised him slightly, because 3 years of mopping floors and single fatherhood and eating whatever Lily didn't finish had changed him in ways he hadn't entirely tracked. But the suit fit. The shoulders sat right. He buttoned the jacket and looked at himself in the mirror on the back of the bathroom door. He looked like someone completely different from the man who had pushed a cleaning cart through these hospital hallways for 22 days. That was the point. He heard Lily's alarm go off down the hall, then the familiar sound of her turning it off and immediately going back to sleep, which was why he went to her door and knocked twice sharply. "I know," she said from inside. "Lunch is made." A pause. "You're wearing the suit." He looked down at himself. "How do you know that you can't see me?" "Your footsteps sound different," she said. He stood in the hallway for a moment processing that. "Get up," he said. "Getting up," she said in a voice that meant she wasn't yet. I got her up, got her fed, got her out the door by 7:20, with her backpack and her lunch and the dignity of a child who has managed her morning with minimal adult intervention, which she valued tremendously. He watched her walk to the corner where the bus stopped. She turned once and looked back at him at the suit with the evaluating look of someone assembling information. Then she waved and turned back. He got in the car. He drove to Green Valley Regional Hospital for the 23rd time. But this time, he didn't park in the employee lot on the east side near the service entrance. He parked in the visitor lot. He walked through the front entrance, past the reception desk where Deb sat behind her partition, who glanced up at him with the automatic professional non-recognition of a woman who had never once truly looked at the janitor, and therefore had no frame of reference for the man in the suit. He walked to the elevator. He pressed 5. The board meeting was at 8:30 a.m. It was 8:04. He had 26 minutes. He used them. He went first to the 3rd floor. He walked to the nurse's station where Carla was starting her shift, already moving with the efficient urgency of someone who had too much to do and was going to do all of it anyway. Carla looked up at the sound of his footsteps. She looked at him. She looked at the suit. Then she looked at his face. "Daniel," she said. "Morning, Carla," he said. "I have about 4 minutes. I want to tell you something." She put down the chart she was holding. "What you did yesterday," he said. "Responding fast, getting Wilson, not asking me to justify myself when there was no time to justify myself. That mattered. The patient is alive this morning in part because you did not waste 30 seconds questioning what you were looking at." Carla was quiet for a moment. She had the look of someone being told something true that she hadn't expected to hear. "How do you know he's alive?" she asked. You don't have chart access." "Wilson texted me at 6 this morning," Daniel said. "He's stable. Going to need a stent probably too, but he's stable." Carla looked at him for a long moment. At the suit. At his face. "Who are you?" she asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. The honest question. "Someone who's been watching this place for 3 weeks," Daniel said. "And someone who has seen what you do on this floor and how you do it." He held her gaze. "You're one of the reasons I can walk into that meeting this morning and tell a more complicated story than the one they're expecting." He left her standing at the nurse's station. He went to the oncology floor. Emily Carter was there. She was always there. End of one shift, blurring into the beginning of another, sitting at a workstation, with a phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear, a pen in her hand, writing something down. She looked up when he came around the corner. She looked at the suit the way Carla had, with the specific expression of someone whose brain is running 2 processes simultaneously, recognition and reassessment. She ended the call. Put the phone down. "You're not a janitor," she said. "I was a janitor," Daniel said, "for 22 days. Before that, I was the state patient safety advisor and the healthcare quality director for a regional hospital network for 15 years. He pulled a card from his breast pocket, his actual card, the one with his actual credentials, and set it on the workstation in front of her. "I've been here investigating complaints about care equity." Emily looked at the card. She looked at him. Her face went through several things very quickly. Surprise, then something that might have been betrayal. Then something that wasn't quite anger, but was adjacent to it. The reaction of someone who has been watched without knowing it. And then finally, it settled into something clear and determined. "The things I said," she started, "in the hallway, about Marcus Webb. If I'd known someone was..." "You would have said exactly the same things," Daniel said. "Because you were right. And because you're the kind of person who says the right thing regardless of who's listening." He paused. "That's what I needed to confirm. That there were still people like you in this building fighting for what this place is supposed to be." Emily was quiet. "Marcus Webb went home yesterday," she said, "with a glucometer, 3 months of medication samples, and a referral to a community health clinic that takes uninsured patients." "I know," Daniel said. "I checked." A pause. Her jaw tightened. "So what happens now?" "Board meeting," Daniel said. 8:30, 5th floor. He looked at her steadily. "There are things I'm going to say in that room that are going to be difficult for this institution. And there are things I'm going to say about what this institution gets right. I need you to know that both of those things are true, and both of them matter." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "Are you going to fix it?" she asked. Not naively. The question of someone who has tried to fix things from the inside and knows exactly how hard that is. "I'm going to force the conversation that makes fixing it possible," Daniel said. "What happens after that is up to every person in this building." He left her with that. He had 8 minutes. He went to the 5th floor. The conference room where the board meeting was scheduled was at the end of the administrative hallway, the same hallway where he'd pushed the mop cart past Gerald Fitch's conference room on day 14. The irony of it was not lost on him. He stood outside the door for a moment. Through the glass panel, he could see the room was already half full. Board members. Senior administrators. Gerald Fitch, at the far end of the table, already talking to someone, already working the room, already managing the narrative, because men like Fitch always arrived early enough to shape the atmosphere before anyone else could. Roberta Huang was there seated mid-table with a folder in front of her that was thick enough to have weight. She saw him through the glass. She gave him a look that said, "I'm here. I have the documentation. Let's do this." He pushed open the door. The room had the particular buzzing ambient noise of a professional gathering that has not yet been called to order, multiple conversations. The sound of chairs adjusting someone's phone muffled in a jacket pocket. 7 people around a table, 3 more standing at the side. The conversation stopped, not dramatically, not all at once. In the staggered way that silence falls when something unexpected enters a room, and each person processes it at a slightly different rate. One by one, the voices dropped until the only sound was Daniel's shoes on the conference room floor and the soft closing of the door behind him. Gerald Fitch was looking at him with the expression of a man who is rapidly running several mental calculations and doesn't like the results of any of them. Richard Harmon, who was standing near the window, went very still. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Okafor, 60, silver-haired, with the composed authority of someone who has chaired enough difficult meetings to know when one is about to begin, looked at Daniel with measured attention. "Can I help you?" she said, not unkindly. Daniel placed the 31-page report on the table. Then he placed his notebook beside it. "My name is Daniel Brooks," he said. "Until yesterday morning, I was the janitor on your 3rd floor." He looked around the room slowly. "Before that, I spent 15 years as a healthcare quality director and state patient safety advisor. And for the last 22 days, I have been conducting a formal investigation of this hospital on behalf of the State Health Oversight Board." The silence was total. Then Fitch said, "That's..." and Daniel looked at him, and something in Daniel's expression stopped the sentence cold. "I will give everyone an opportunity to speak," Daniel said calmly. "I'd like to present first if the board agrees." Patricia Okafor looked at the report on the table. She looked at Daniel. The calculating pause of a very intelligent person, deciding very quickly. "Please," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He began. He spoke for 40 minutes without notes, referring to the report only to direct the board to specific pages and documentation. He spoke about what he had observed. He spoke precisely, not inflamed, not prosecutorial, the way he had learned to speak in 15 years of standing in front of people who needed to be moved toward a decision and not toward defensiveness. He talked about the differential in wait times. He talked about the conversation he'd heard through the conference room door on day 14, citing the date, the time, the names, the specific language used. And he watched Gerald Fitch's face go from controlled professional blankness to something considerably less controlled. He talked about the man with the lanyard. He talked about Deb. He described what he had seen with the specificity of a trained observer, and he placed the documented record on the table, and he said clearly, "This is extortion. It operated in your emergency room with the implied knowledge of at least one reception staff member. I have dates and names." Harmon made a sound, not words, more like the involuntary response of a man who has just felt the floor shift under him. "Mr. Harmon," Daniel said without looking at him directly. "Your response to a medical emergency yesterday morning will be addressed separately in my recommendation to the board. The oversight issue there is distinct from the equity issues but equally serious." Harmon sat down. Daniel talked about Howard Greer. He put a single piece of paper on the table. The name, the date, the timeline, the discrepancy between the official report and the reconstruction he had been able to piece together from multiple sources over his 22 days in the building. "Howard Greer was 71 years old," Daniel said. "He came through your emergency room on a Thursday evening with chest pain. He was triaged as level 3, a determination that was defensible given the information available at that moment. But what is not defensible is that he sat in your waiting room for 4 hours with ongoing chest pain, mentioned it twice to staff members, and received no reassessment. Because he was elderly, uninsured, had no family member present to escalate on his behalf, and did not know how to advocate for himself in a system that was not designed to make advocacy easy for people like him." Patricia Okafor had stopped writing. She was looking at Daniel with the expression of a woman who is no longer managing a meeting, she is reckoning with something. "He died," Daniel said, "of a cardiac event, in your waiting room, while he was waiting to be seen." He paused. "And the official report described the triage as appropriate given available information, which is technically accurate, which is also an incomplete account of a preventable death." Silence. Then Fitch spoke. He had recovered his composure not fully, but enough. The professional recovery of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and knows that the goal is not to win an argument, it is to survive the meeting. "Mr. Brooks," Fitch said, "the issues you're raising are presented in a way that doesn't account for the operational realities of a hospital with our volume and resource constraints. The decisions around resource allocation are not..." "Gerald." Patricia Okafor's voice was quiet and final. "We'll hear from you after the presentation." Fitch stopped. Okafor looked at Daniel. "Please continue." Daniel continued. He talked about what was working. He talked about Emily Carter. He talked about James Wilson. He talked about the nurses on the overnight shift who stayed late because they couldn't leave a patient frightened and alone. He talked about Carla and what she'd done in that hallway yesterday morning. "This hospital has not failed uniformly," Daniel said. "It has failed systemically in specific areas while maintaining genuine excellence in others. The people on the front lines of care in this building are in many cases fighting the system rather than being supported by it. And that is a solvable problem. It requires leadership that is willing to look at what I've put in front of you this morning and say, this is not acceptable, and we are going to change it." He looked at Fitch. "It also requires removing the people and practices that have made this place unsafe for its most vulnerable patients." Fitch's jaw tightened. "I want to be clear about something," Daniel said. "I am not here because I want to destroy this hospital. I'm here because a man named Howard Greer died in your waiting room, and I want to make sure that never happens again. And because there are people in this building right now who are trying to prevent the next Howard Greer with whatever resources the institution gives them, which is currently not enough." He placed one final document on the table. "My recommendations," he said. 31 pages, implementation timeline, accountability benchmarks, specific policy changes, and a list of individuals whose continued employment in their current roles I believe represents an ongoing risk to patient safety." Fitch looked at the folder. His name was on page 3. Daniel knew this. He had put it there deliberately, not to be cruel, not for satisfaction, but because the documentation was specific, and the recommendations were specific, and the people who had made specific decisions that harmed specific patients needed to be specifically named. Okafor picked up the report. She turned to page 3. The room was completely entirely silent. Then Roberta Huang opened her folder. "I'd like to add," Huang said, with the voice of a woman who has been waiting 14 months to say this. 14 months of internal documentation that corroborates the patterns Mr. Brooks has described. "I submitted portions of this documentation through internal channels on 4 separate occasions. It was tabled each time." She looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at the table. "I am formally requesting," Huang continued, "that this documentation be entered into the board's record and considered alongside Mr. Brooks' report in any subsequent review." Okafor was already writing. What happened next took 3 hours. 3 hours of the most difficult institutional conversation Daniel had witnessed in 15 years of professional experience, which was saying something because he had witnessed a great many difficult institutional conversations. He had sat in rooms where people discovered that systems they believed in had failed catastrophically. He had sat in rooms where administrators realized that the gap between their public mission and their operational reality was wide enough to swallow people. He had never sat in a room quite like this one. Because in this room the people on the right side of the conversation kept winning, Fitch argued. He argued well. He was, as Daniel had assessed, not a stupid man. He cited operational constraints and financial realities and the complexity of running a large regional medical center with competing resource demands. He cited the specific regulatory language around triage assessment that had been applied in the Howard Greer case. He cited 3 years of positive board reports. And each time he finished, Daniel or Huang responded with a document, a date, a name, a timestamp. The third time it happened. Fitch making a claim, and Daniel placing a piece of paper. "I need you to stop." Fitch stopped. "I need you to stop," she said again. "And I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you." Her voice was the voice of a woman who has made a decision and is now on the other side of making it. This board is going to commission a full independent review based on the documentation presented today. That review is going to take 60 days. During those 60 days, I am recommending, and I expect the board to vote to confirm this today, that your operational authority over resource allocation decisions be suspended pending the outcome. Fitch's face went through something complicated. "Patricia, I'm not finished." She looked at him steadily. "The patient communication failure I'm reading about on page 9 of this report. The utilization review process described on page 14. The incident on page 22. She set down the report. "Gerald, I have been on this board for 6 years. I trusted your numbers. I trusted your presentations. And I am looking at documentation this morning that tells me I was presented with a version of this hospital that was managed to look healthy while people were being failed inside it." A long silence. "I'm very angry right now," she said. "I'm going to do my best not to let that determine outcomes, because outcomes need to be determined by the review and by process. But I want you to understand that the anger is there, and it is appropriate, and I think everyone in this room feels it." She looked around the table. Nobody disagreed. The vote happened at 11:47 a.m. Unanimous. The independent review was commissioned. Fitch's operational authority was suspended. An emergency task force on patient care equity was authorized. Harmon's role was referred for separate HR review. The extortion matter the man with the lanyard. The arrangement that Daniel had documented was referred to the hospital's legal team with a recommendation that law enforcement be involved. Daniel sat at the table while all of it happened. He did not feel triumphant. That was the thing he had not entirely anticipated. He had expected some version of satisfaction, the particular release that comes from finishing a long and difficult thing. But what he felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. Something that was less like victory and more like the aftermath of it. Like a room after a fire has been put out. The fire is gone. The damage is visible. The work of rebuilding has not yet begun, but it must begin now, and the scale of it is clear in a way it wasn't before. After the vote, as board members gathered their papers, and the room began to dissolve into smaller conversations, Patricia Okafor came to stand beside Daniel. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why a janitor?" Daniel looked at her. "I needed to see the hospital the way the hospital sees its most vulnerable patients," he said. "The ones it doesn't think are watching, the ones it doesn't perform for." He paused. "Because that's who tells you the truth about a place. Not the patients who know how to complain loudly. Not the staff who know they're being evaluated. The people the institution has decided don't matter enough to manage." Okafor nodded slowly. "The man yesterday," she said. "In the hallway. Thomas Greer. You saved his life." "Wilson saved his life," Daniel said. "I bought him the 2 minutes Wilson needed." "That's not how Wilson described it to me this morning," she said. Daniel said nothing. She held out her hand. He shook it. The thing about that handshake was this. It was the first time in 23 days that anyone in that building had extended a hand to him as a peer. As someone whose knowledge and judgment and humanity were legible to the person across from him. It should have felt like a restoration. And it did partly. But only partly. Because Daniel had spent 22 days being invisible, and you don't shake off 22 days of invisibility in a handshake, however genuine. You carry it out the door with you. You carry it to your car. You carry it home. He was almost at the elevator when Fitch caught up with him. He hadn't expected that. Fitch walked fast. The walk of a man in a hurry who is trying to look like he isn't. He came around the corner of the administrative hallway and fell into step beside Daniel, which required an effort given that Daniel did not slow down. "You could have come to me," Fitch said. His voice was controlled, professional. The anger was underneath it, carefully managed. "Before all of this, if you had come to me directly, you wouldn't have shown me what I saw," Daniel said. He didn't stop walking. "That's the entire point. What you observed was taken out of context. I was in the context, Daniel said. For 22 days. There was no version of the context I wasn't in. Fitch stopped walking. Daniel kept going. Brooks. Fitch's voice dropped the professionalism. What was underneath it was something rawer. Not quite rage, something more like a man confronting the fact that a version of himself he believed was hidden has been seen clearly and described accurately, and he doesn't know what to do with that. This hospital operates in the real world, with real budget constraints, with real resource limitations. The decisions I made... Daniel stopped. He turned around. He looked at Fitch from 12 feet away in the administrative hallway, where 23 days ago he had pushed a mop bucket past a conference room door. Howard Greer, Daniel said. 71 years old. Fitch was quiet. Say his name, Daniel said. Fitch stared at him. You made decisions that created the conditions in which a man sat in a waiting room for 4 hours with chest pain and died, Daniel said. I'm not saying you wanted that. I'm saying the decisions you made and the language you used to justify them created a system in which that was possible. And I want you to say his name, because he is not a budget line. He is not a Q-score metric. He was a person, and this hospital failed him. And you need to understand that in a specific and personal way before you walk out of this building today. A long silence. Fitch said, Howard Greer. Daniel held his gaze for another moment. Then he turned and walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. As the doors were closing, he looked back down the hallway. Fitch was still standing there, not moving. Just standing in the administrative hallway with his hands at his sides and the particular stillness of a man who has just been given something he's going to have to decide what to do with. The doors closed. Daniel was alone in the elevator between floors. He exhaled. The full weight of the morning came down. Not crushing, he'd prepared for this, built himself up to carry it. But substantial. The weight of 22 days completed. The weight of a report submitted, and a vote taken, and a name said out loud in a hallway. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked through the main entrance, past the reception desk, out the front doors, into the late morning air of a Thursday in Ohio, that was cool and slightly overcast, and completely indifferent to everything that had just happened inside the building behind him. He sat in his car. He sat there for a long time. He called Margaret Osei. She picked up on the second ring. Done, he said. A pause. How did it go? She asked. He thought about the question. All the ways to answer it. They heard it, he said. The board heard it. Fitch is suspended pending review. The extortion matter is going to law enforcement. The independent review is authorized. And, Margaret said, because she knew him well enough to hear the and in what he wasn't saying yet. And it's not over, Daniel said. The vote was today. The change is what happens after today. And that's going to take time, and it's going to take people who care enough to keep fighting it after I walk away. Do you think they're there? He thought about Emily Carter arguing in a hallway. James Wilson in a chapel before 7 in the morning. Carla moving without being asked. Roberta Huang carrying 14 months of documentation because she refused to stop believing the documentation mattered. Yeah, he said. They're there. A pause. Are you okay? Margaret asked. Daniel looked through the windshield at the front entrance of Green Valley Regional Hospital. I will be, he said. He started the car. He had to pick up Lily at 4:15. He had exactly enough time. He picked up Lily at 4:15 exactly. She came out of the school building the way she always did, third in line backpack, half unzipped one sock, slightly lower than the other, with the expression of someone who has survived the day and is now ready to debrief about it. She saw his car. She saw him in the suit. She climbed into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt and looked at him with the particular attentiveness of a child who has been waiting all day to take the temperature of someone she loves. How did it go? She asked. He pulled out of the school pickup line. It went, he said. She considered that. Good went or hard went? Both, he said. Mostly good. But the kind of good that's also hard. She nodded slowly, as if that made complete sense, which for her it apparently did. They drove for a while in the specific comfortable silence that develops between two people who have lived together long enough to not need to fill every moment with words. Then Lily said without looking away from the window, "Did you help people today, Dad?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah, baby," he said. "I think I did." She nodded once, definitively the case closed. "Good," she said. "Can we have pizza?" He almost laughed. Not quite, but close. "Yeah," he said. "We can have pizza." That night, after the pizza, and after Lily's bath, and after the 35 minutes of reading time that was technically 20 minutes, but which Daniel had never in his life managed to cut off at 20, because the 20 minutes always ended in the middle of something that night. After all of it, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and his phone, and the particular silence of a house where a child is asleep, and the world has gone quiet enough to hear yourself think. His phone had 41 unread messages. He read them in order. The first 12 were from numbers he didn't recognize, journalists. He guessed because news traveled fast in institutional circles and the board meeting would not stay internal for long. He didn't answer those. There were 3 from Margaret Osei, each progressively more detailed as the afternoon news reached her through channels. The last one said, "The board chair called me directly. She said you were extraordinary. I already knew that. Call me tomorrow." There was one from James Wilson. It said, "Thomas Greer is asking about the man who stayed with him in the hallway. I didn't know what to tell him. I assume you'll figure out the right thing." There was one from Emily Carter. It said, "The overnight staff found out this evening. 3 nurses asked me if it was true. I told them yes. I also told them what you said, that they're the reason you could walk in there and tell a more complicated story. I thought you should know they heard that." There was one from Roberta Huang. It said, "The legal team has been briefed. The person with the lanyard has been identified. His name is Victor Selk. He is not an employee. He was a contractor with Parking Garage Access who had developed an arrangement with 2 reception staff members over approximately 18 months. The police were notified at 3 p.m. I thought you'd want to know tonight rather than tomorrow." Daniel read that one twice. Victor Selk. A name for the man with the lanyard. An arrangement of 18 months. Mr. Delgado's hand going to his jacket pocket in the ER entrance on day 17. He set the phone down. He sat with that for a moment. The specific feeling of a piece of the picture sliding into place, not satisfying exactly, more like the grim acknowledgement that the thing you suspected was worse than you hoped. 18 months. He picked up the phone and texted Huang back. "Thank you. Keep me updated on the legal timeline. And thank you for today." The 14 months of documentation mattered. It was the difference between a report and a case. He turned off the kitchen light. He stood in the dark for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in a very long time. He went to the living room, to the small table in the corner where Claire's photograph sat. The one from the hiking trip they'd taken the summer before Lily was born. Claire laughing at something out of frame. Her hair pulled back, the particular light of late afternoon, making everything around her look like it was glad she was there. He stood in front of the photograph. "I did something today," he said quietly, to the room, to the photograph, to whatever version of Claire still lived in the parts of him that hadn't stopped loving her for a single day since he lost her. "I think it mattered. I think Howard Greer mattered. I think the way we let systems make people invisible until they disappear entirely, I think that mattered enough to fight." He paused. "I know you would have gone in on day 1, he said. "Guns blazing. You would not have lasted 48 hours as a janitor before you found someone to argue with." He almost smiled. "I know that. I did it the slow way, the documented way. But I did it." He stood there a moment longer. Then he went to bed. The next 4 weeks were the kind of weeks that look quiet from the outside and are anything but. The independent review team arrived on a Monday morning. 5 people with lanyards and clipboards, and the practiced neutral expression of professionals who have learned to enter difficult institutional environments without projecting judgment before they've gathered evidence. Daniel had worked with 2 of them before. He briefed them on the first day in a conference room on the 5th floor, the same conference room where the board meeting had happened, which felt deliberate in a way he hadn't entirely planned. I gave them the notebook, all 47 pages. He walked them through the documentation the way he'd walk the board through the report, but with more granularity, the specific dates, the specific interactions, the patterns that only became visible over time. The lead reviewer, a woman named Dr. Andrea Marsh, listened without interrupting and took notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly where the important information would be. When Daniel finished, she said, "The Howard Greer case. You reconstructed the timeline independently." "Yes." "From what sources?" "ER staff interviews informal conducted during my time on the floor. Shift logs I accessed through the janitorial access to administrative areas. The official report. And 3 separate individuals who were on duty that evening, who independently, and without knowledge of each other, described the same sequence of events." Marsh looked at him over the top of her notebook. "Those individuals. Are they willing to speak on record?" Daniel had already thought about this, had already had the conversations. 2 of them are. The third has concerns about retaliation. The retaliation concern will be addressed by the board's whistleblower protections, which were expanded as part of the emergency resolution. "I told them that," Daniel said. "I'll follow up." Marsh nodded, wrote something. Then, "Mr. Brooks, the extortion matter. The police investigation is proceeding separately. But the systemic conditions that allowed it to operate, the gaps in ER reception oversight, the informal contractor access protocols, those are within our review scope. I want to make sure we have everything you observed in that specific area." "Page 31 of the report," Daniel said. "And pages 12 through 15 of the notebook. I've flagged the relevant sections." She turned to page 31. She read for approximately 90 seconds. She looked up. "You witnessed this directly." "I witnessed the initiation of an interaction," Daniel said. "I documented what I observed, including the directional gesture from the reception staff member, the response of the man identified as Victor Selk, and the subsequent behavior of the patient. I did not witness the exchange of money directly. The inference is supported by the pattern and by the subsequent police investigation." "Understood." She made a note. "This is thorough work, Mr. Brooks." "It needed to be," Daniel said. She looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her professional composure, not unprofessionally, just the slight human acknowledgement that breaks through even the most practiced, neutral expression sometimes. "Can I ask you something off the record?" she said. "You can ask. 22 days as a janitor, in a hospital where anyone who spent 5 minutes with you would understand that you were not simply a member of the cleaning staff." She paused. "How did you manage it? The discipline of it? Watching things happen and not intervening," Daniel said. "Yes." He thought about Roy in the family waiting room, about Emily arguing for Marcus Webb, about James Wilson in the chapel. "I intervened when lives were at stake," he said. "Thomas Greer in the hallway, Roy Kowalski's 6 hours without information. I made judgment calls about when staying invisible was the mission and when being a human being in a hallway took precedence." He paused. "The discipline wasn't in being invisible. The discipline was in knowing the difference." Marsh held his gaze. "That distinction," she said, "is going to be in my report." The review ran 60 days. Daniel was not in the building for most of it. His formal role had ended with the board meeting, and his presence would have complicated the review team's independent access. He went back to his life. Back to Lily's school schedule and the parent-teacher conference he finally attended, and the quiet routines of a man who has finished something large and is allowing himself to be small for a while. But the hospital called him back 3 times. The first time was on day 9 of the review, when Patricia Okafor called him personally at 7 in the morning. "We have a problem," she said. "I was making Lily's lunch." He tucked the phone between his ear and shoulder. "Tell me." "Gerald Fitch. He's retained legal representation, and he's claiming that the investigative methodology was improper. Specifically, that an undercover investigation conducted without explicit board authorization violates his due process rights as an employee." Daniel folded the note for Lily's lunch. "Today's going to be a good day. I believe in you." He put it in the box. "The State Health Oversight Board authorized the investigation," he said. "The letter of authorization is on file. It predates my first shift by 11 days. The investigative methodology, including the undercover approach, was disclosed to the board chair at the outset, and her signed acknowledgement is in the records. A pause on Okafor's end. I didn't know about the prior disclosure. Margaret Osei can confirm it. She has the documentation. He closed the lunchbox. Fitch's lawyers are going to look for procedural hooks. That one doesn't hold. Tell your legal team to ask Margaret for the file. All right. A pause. You anticipated this. I've done this before, Daniel said. When the substance is indefensible, people go after the process. It's a pattern. How confident are you that the process holds? Daniel picked up the lunchbox. Completely, he said. Every step was documented and authorized. Fitch's lawyers will spend 2 weeks on this and find nothing. What they're really doing is buying time and hoping the board loses nerve. The board is not losing nerve, Okafor said with the quiet certainty of a woman who knows her own mind. Good, Daniel said. Then there's nothing to worry about. He hung up and put Lily's lunch by the door. The second time the hospital called him back was day 23 of the review, and the caller was someone he hadn't expected. The number that came up was from inside the hospital, an extension he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. Mr. Brooks. A man's voice. Older. Slightly rough around the edges the way a voice gets when it's been through things. My name is Thomas Greer. Daniel stopped what he was doing. Thomas Greer. 67. Silver hair. Business clothes. The man who went down in the third-floor hallway at 7:14 a.m. on day 22. Mr. Greer, Daniel said. How are you feeling? Better, Greer said. 2 stents. They tell me I'm going to be fine as long as I stop eating the things I like. A pause. A dry, exhausted humor in it. I'm calling because Dr. Wilson told me who you were. What you actually were, I mean. Not the... He stopped. You were the janitor who helped me. I was there, Daniel said. Wilson did the work. That's what Wilson said about you. Another pause. Mr. Brooks, I need to tell you something. I've been lying in this hospital for 3 weeks, and I've had a lot of time to think about things, and one of the things I've been thinking about is that I want to know why you did what you did. What do you mean? You could have called for help and stepped back, Greer said. You were a janitor. Nobody would have expected anything more. Nobody would have blamed you for stepping back. You were in trouble, Daniel said simply. Lots of people pass trouble in hallways, Greer said. Daniel was quiet for a moment. My wife died in a hospital, he said. Because of a system failure. Because of a gap between what should have happened and what actually happened. And I spent a long time after that believing there was nothing I could do about the size of that gap. He paused. I was wrong. There are things you can do. You can get close enough to see the gap clearly. You can document it. You can put the documentation in front of people who have the authority to close it. He paused again. And when a man is on the floor in a hallway, and you're the one standing there, you can stay. A long silence on Greer's end. I have a daughter, Greer said. His voice had changed. Something in it had opened. She's 42, drives up from Cincinnati. She's been here every day. He stopped. She would have been at a funeral, if you hadn't. He stopped again. I want you to know that I know that. I'm glad you're here, Mr. Greer, Daniel said. That's all. They talked for another 10 minutes about the hospital, about the review, about the changes Greer had already noticed from his room. Small things, a nurse who had checked in on him without being asked, a care coordinator who had spent 45 minutes with his daughter going over his discharge plan, so she understood exactly what happened next. Small things. But Greer noticed them. It's different, Greer said toward the end of the call. I can't explain exactly how, but something in this place is different than it was when they first brought me in. It's going to keep being different, Daniel said. People in this building are fighting for it. After he hung up, Daniel sat for a long time with the phone in his hand. The particular emotional weight of a call like that one, not heavy in the way that bad news is heavy, but substantial. The weight of knowing that a specific human being is alive in a specific hospital room in Columbus, Ohio, with a daughter who drove up from Cincinnati every day because a system that was designed to be invisible to people like him had been made briefly consequentially visible. He put the phone down. He picked up a pen. He wrote Thomas Greer's name in the margin of his notebook, not as documentation, just as a name. The third time the hospital called him back was the one he hadn't planned for, and it came from a direction he hadn't anticipated. It was day 31 of the review, a Saturday morning. Lily was at a friend's house, which gave Daniel the rare and slightly disorienting experience of an entirely quiet house and no particular obligation to fill it. How was reading an actual book paper, the kind you hold in your hands when the call came. The number was Richard Harmon's. Daniel looked at the screen for a full 5 seconds before answering. "Harmon," he said. "Mr. Brooks." Harmon's voice was different from what Daniel remembered. The authority was gone from it, not replaced by weakness, something more complicated than that. Something that sounded like a man who has been sitting alone with a difficult truth for 31 days and has decided to do something with it. "I know I'm the last person you expected to hear from." "Top 5, Daniel said honestly. "A beat." "Right." Harmon cleared his throat. "I'm calling because the HR review is ongoing. I have my own legal process to think about. I've been advised not to make contact with anyone involved in the investigation." "Then why are you calling me Silence?" "Because I keep thinking about what you said in the hallway," Harmon said. "After Thomas Greer, you said he's alive. Whatever comes next, that's the thing that happened today." He paused. "I've been thinking about that. The way you said it. And I've been thinking about all the things I prioritized over that sentence." Daniel said nothing. "I did my job," Harmon said. "I genuinely believed I was doing my job. The protocols around non-clinical personnel in patient areas are there for real reasons. Liability. Scope of practice. I wasn't wrong about the reasons." "No," Daniel agreed. "You weren't wrong about the reasons. But, Daniel said, the reasons exist to protect patients. And when you applied the protocol in that hallway, the effect of it would have been to harm the patient in front of you. And you chose the protocol over the patient." A long silence. "Yeah," Harmon said. Finally. Quietly. "Yeah, I did." Daniel waited. "I don't know what to do with that," Harmon said. "I'm telling my lawyer one version of events. I'm telling myself a different version. And neither version accounts for the fact that I stood in that hallway and told you to step back while a man was on the floor." He stopped. I'm not calling for absolution, Mr. Brooks. I don't think you're in the business of that." "I'm not," Daniel agreed. "I just needed to say it out loud to someone who was actually there." Another pause. "That I know what I did. That I know what it would have meant if you'd listened to me." The honesty of it landed on Daniel like something cold and clarifying. This was not the conversation he had expected. Harmon was not the person he had expected it from. But he'd been doing this long enough to know that people surprised you, that the person you'd written off most completely sometimes turned out to be capable of the most unexpected accountability. "What are you going to do with it?" Daniel asked. "I don't know yet," Harmon said. "But I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I did." A pause. "I thought you should know that." "I appreciate you telling me," Daniel said. And he meant it. After the call, he sat with the book closed in his lap and thought about the specific human complexity of a man like Richard Harmon. Not a villain, not a hero. Something much more ordinary, and therefore much more important. A man who had built a professional identity around institutional process and found himself in a critical moment on the wrong side of it. Who had stood in a hallway with a choice and made the wrong one, and now had to live inside that knowledge. That was the work, Daniel thought. Not the dramatic confrontations, not the board meetings and the reports and the voted resolutions. The real work was the individual human beings inside the system, each carrying their own version of what had happened, each having to decide what to do with what they knew. He thought about Gerald Fitch. About the moment in the hallway when he'd said Howard Greer's name. Daniel didn't know what Fitch had done with that moment, whether it had changed anything in him, or whether it had been absorbed and processed away by the particular self-protective machinery of a man who had spent years converting human cost into operational language. He didn't know. He thought about Emily Carter, about Carla, about James Wilson, who had texted him twice since the board meeting with updates on patients they'd never discussed, but who Wilson somehow understood Daniel would want to know about. Marcus Webb's community health clinic appointment had gone well. The elderly woman whose care conference had been rescheduled 3 times had finally had it, and her family had a plan. Small things. But Wilson texted them because he understood in the way that people who have worked alongside each other in difficult conditions developed the capacity to understand that Daniel needed to know that the specific people he had seen in that hospital were okay, that they had landed somewhere. The review concluded on day 61. Daniel received the final report on a Wednesday morning via secure email from Dr. Andrea Marsh. He read it at the kitchen table with coffee, the way he'd read everything connected to this investigation, methodically, completely, without skimming, because you don't skim things that matter. The report was comprehensive. It confirmed everything Daniel had documented and added to it the review team's access to internal systems and staff interviews, had produced additional evidence that had extended the picture further than his 47 pages. The inequity in wait times was documented across 18 months of ER data. The Utilization Review Committee's decision-making patterns were analyzed and found to correlate significantly with insurance status, in ways that could not be explained by clinical factors alone. The Howard Greer case was addressed in Section 4. The review team's reconstruction of the timeline with access to documentation that Daniel hadn't had confirmed and expanded what he'd pieced together from interviews. The official report's language about appropriate triage assessment was characterized in careful and precise language as a technically accurate statement that constituted a materially incomplete account of the circumstances of Mr. Greer's death. A recommendation was made that the findings be forwarded to the state medical examiner for consideration of a revised death report classification. Daniel read that paragraph twice. Then he called Margaret. She picked up before the first ring finished. "You read it," she said. "I read it." Section 4. "Yeah." A pause. "Daniel, I know what Section 4 means to you. I know why you're sitting there right now." Her voice was careful. The care of someone who knows a person well enough to know where the tender spots are. "Howard Greer's family has been notified. His daughter, she lives in Dayton. She's been contacted by the board. They've offered to meet with her." "What did she say?" "She said she's been waiting for someone to call for 14 months, Margaret said quietly. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about the particular shape of 14 months of waiting, of having a father, and then not having a father, and being told in the careful language of official reports that the care he received was appropriate given available information, and carrying that sentence inside you for 14 months because there was nothing else to carry. "Is she going to be okay?" Daniel asked. Knowing it was an unanswerable question, asking it anyway. "She's going to have answers," Margaret said. "And accountability. That's not the same as okay. But it's something." "Yeah," Daniel said. "It's something." The recommendations in the final report were extensive. Gerald Fitch's employment was terminated. 2 members of the Utilization Review Committee were placed on probationary status with mandatory retraining. The contractor access program that had allowed Victor Selk his 18 months of arrangement making in the ER entrance was eliminated. The reception staff members involved were terminated. New protocols were established for family communication in the ER-specific timed non-optional check-ins with family members of patients in treatment, regardless of the patient's insurance status or the perceived complexity of the case. The triage reassessment protocol was revised. Patients who had been waiting for more than 90 minutes were to receive an automatic second assessment. No exceptions. A patient advocate position was created. Full-time, reporting directly to the board. The advocate's mandate was explicit and unusual in the specificity of its protections. They had the authority to escalate any patient care concern to board level, could not be overridden by departmental leadership, and had dedicated access to legal resources if retaliation was attempted. The board offered the position to Emily Carter. She called Daniel the evening after she received the offer. "I don't know if I'm qualified," she said. He could hear in her voice that she had been thinking about it for hours, the way a person's voice sounds when they've been running the same conversation with themselves over and over and haven't reached a conclusion. "What makes you think you're not?" Daniel said. "I'm a nurse. I know patient care. I don't know board governance. I don't know institutional advocacy at that level. I don't know how to—" "Emily," Daniel said. "Who fought for Marcus Webb?" A pause. "Me," she said. "Who argued with a senior physician for a patient who had no one else arguing for him. Me. Who stayed on the floor an hour after her shift every morning because there was always someone who needed her." Silence. "That's the job," Daniel said. "The governance and the process and the institutional mechanics, those you can learn. You can learn anything. But the thing that makes someone actually capable of that position, the thing that makes it real, rather than performative, you already have. You've had it the whole time." A long pause. "Will you help me?" Emily asked. "If I take it. If there are things I don't understand. Will you?" "Call me any time," Daniel said. "I mean that. Any time." She took the job. Richard Harmon's HR review concluded with a written warning and a mandatory retraining program. He was not terminated. Daniel had been asked as part of the review process whether he believed Harmon's continued employment represented a risk to patient safety. He had thought about that question for 24 hours before answering. He had answered not if the training addresses the core issue. Which is not that Harmon doesn't know the protocols. He knows them perfectly. The issue is whether he understands what protocols are for. If the training addresses that, he's not a risk. He's potentially an asset, because a person who has been on the wrong side of a serious mistake and has genuinely reckoned with it sometimes becomes more careful than someone who has never been tested. I didn't know if that answer had influenced the outcome. He supposed it didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd given his honest assessment rather than the easier one. 6 weeks after the review concluded, Daniel got an unexpected email. The sender's name was Grace Greer. The subject line was, "Thank you." He read it at his kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Lily was still asleep. "Dear Mr. Brooks," it began. "My name is Grace Greer. Howard Greer was my father." He read it slowly. The email was 3 paragraphs long and had clearly been written and rewritten. You could feel in the construction of the sentences, the work of a person trying to find the right words for something that doesn't have right words. She wrote about her father. He'd been a retired teacher, high school history, 31 years. He'd coached baseball for 18 of those years and had kept in touch with former students in the way that certain teachers do. The ones who understand that the relationship doesn't end at graduation. She wrote that she still got calls from people who had been in his classroom, that they always started the same way, "Your father changed something for me." She wrote about the 14 months. She wrote about them with the directness of someone who has moved through enough grief to be able to describe it without flinching. Not without pain, but without flinching. She wrote about what it had felt like to be told that the care was appropriate. She wrote about what it had felt like 14 months later to be told that it was more complicated than that. She wrote, "I'm not writing to tell you that I'm okay, because I don't think okay is the right word for where I am. I'm writing to tell you that my father's name was said in a boardroom by someone who made sure it mattered. By someone who went into that building and looked at the place where my father was invisible and made it visible. I needed to know that someone did that. I needed to know his name was said." Daniel read that paragraph 3 times. Then he set the phone down and sat in the quiet Sunday kitchen and let himself feel the full weight of it. Not the professional satisfaction of a completed investigation. Not the institutional validation of a successful report. But this, a woman named Grace in Dayton, Ohio, who had her father for 61 years and then didn't, and who needed to know that someone in a hospital hallway had seen him. After a long time he picked up the phone. He wrote back. He wrote, "Grace, your father's name was the reason I went into that hospital. It will be the reason I remember what the work is for. He was not invisible. He was never invisible. The hospital just forgot how to see. I hope it has remembered now." He sent it. He sat for a moment. From upstairs came the sound of Lily's alarm, then the sound of her turning it off, then the sound of her actually getting up, which was progress, and the soft footfall of her feet on the hallway floor. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair unsettled, one eye still more asleep than the other. "Sunday," she said as a complete sentence expressing considerable feeling. "Sunday," Daniel agreed. She sat across from him at the table. She looked at his face with the particular attentiveness she brought to these early morning readings of his emotional state. "You were doing the thing again," she said. "What thing?" "The thing where you're thinking about someone who isn't here anymore." He looked at her, at Claire's eyes looking back at him from his daughter's face. "Yeah," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand on top of his. The hand of an 8-year-old, small, warm, certain of its welcome. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand there and left it. Daniel looked at her hand on his. He thought about Thomas Greer's grip on his arm in a hospital hallway. The desperate particular strength of a person holding on. He thought about Grace Greer's email. He was never invisible. He turned his hand over and held his daughter's hand properly. "What do you want for breakfast?" he said. "Pancakes," she said immediately, which meant she'd been deciding since she woke up. "Pancakes," he agreed. He got up and started making pancakes on a Sunday morning in the kitchen, where the coffee was still warm and the sun was coming through the window at the angle that made everything look like something worth keeping. 3 months after the board meeting, Green Valley Regional Hospital made the local news. Not for a scandal, not for a lawsuit, not for the kind of story that leads with someone's name and ends with a resignation. It made the news because a patient named Dorothy Simmons, 74 years old, uninsured, admitted through the emergency room with a fractured hip on a Tuesday afternoon, had written a letter to the Columbus Dispatch. The letter was 4 paragraphs long. She had written it by hand on stationery with small blue flowers along the top, and mailed it to the newspaper because her granddaughter had told her that was still a thing you could do. The letter said that she had been afraid when she arrived at that hospital. That she had been afraid because she had no insurance card and no family member with her, and a long experience of being in rooms where people looked through her rather than at her. And that what had happened instead was this: a nurse had sat with her while she waited for imaging. A patient advocate had come to her room within the hour and explained every step of what was going to happen, including what it would cost and what assistance she might be eligible for. A doctor had spoken to her like someone whose understanding of her own situation mattered. And when she left 11 days later, she had a follow-up appointment, a medication plan, and the phone number of a social worker who had already called her twice. She wrote, "I have been in hospitals before. I have never been treated like a person before. I want whoever made that change to know that Dorothy Simmons noticed." The Columbus Dispatch ran the letter in full on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, Daniel had received 17 text messages, 4 emails, and 2 voicemails from people he hadn't spoken to in years. He read every one of them at his kitchen table on Friday evening in the particular order they had arrived, which gave the experience the quality of a time lapse, his professional past, reassembling itself around him in the space of a single afternoon. People who had known him as the healthcare quality director, the state advisor, the man in the conference room with the presentation and the policy framework, now reading about the man who had spent 3 weeks pushing a mop cart and seeing in that combination something they wanted to reach out about. One of the texts was from a former colleague named Robert Elias, who had worked alongside Daniel for 4 years at the state level before moving to a private consulting firm. It said, "I read the dispatch piece. Then I read the review summary that got posted to the Oversight Board's public record. I've been in this field for 22 years, Daniel. I have never seen an investigation conducted with that combination of method and guts. Call me when you have a minute." Daniel put his phone down. He thought about that word. Guts. The particular word that people from the outside apply to things that from the inside feel less like courage and more like necessity. The thing you do, because the alternative is looking away, and some people are constitutionally unable to look away. And the question of whether that's strength or compulsion is one Daniel had stopped trying to answer a long time ago. He called Robert Elias on Saturday morning from the car, while Lily was at her soccer game 20 yards away, and he could watch her through the windshield, running after a ball with the total commitment of someone for whom the ball is currently the most important thing in the world. Elias picked up immediately. "I have a proposition," Elias said without preamble, which was how he'd always operated, straight to the point, no runway. Daniel had always appreciated it. "Tell me," Daniel said. "The state legislature has been sitting on a patient equity audit framework for 2 years, Elias said. They commissioned the framework, paid for the framework, and then watched it sit in a committee because nobody wanted to actually put people into hospitals to conduct the kind of ground-level investigation that would make the framework real." A pause. "Until Green Valley." "Green Valley wasn't a legislative initiative," Daniel said. "No, it was the Health Oversight Board acting on complaints. But the methodology, the way the investigation was conducted, the quality of the documentation, the outcome, it's become a proof of concept that the legislative committee didn't have before." Another pause. "They want to formalize it. Create a standing investigative unit with the authority and the methodology to do what you did at Green Valley on a systematic basis across the state." Daniel watched Lily collide enthusiastically with another child while going for the ball, bounce off, and keep running without looking back. "And they want me to build it," Daniel said. "They want you to lead it," Elias said. "Build its staff, it define the methodology, and run the first cohort of investigations." A pause. "It's not a quiet life, Daniel." "No," Daniel said. "It's not. It's also not a janitor's salary. That's not why I did it," Daniel said. And he said it the way you say something that is simply true without weight or emphasis, the way you state a fact about the weather. Elias was quiet for a moment. "I know that," he said. "I know exactly why you did it, which is why I'm calling you and not the 17 other people who could theoretically do this job less well." Daniel watched the soccer game. Lily had the ball now. She was running with it, her face set in the particular expression of total concentration she brought to everything, and the kid guarding her was half a step behind, and Daniel watched her make a move. He'd never seen her make before, a quick cut left, then right, then straight through, and the ball went with her, and the kid guarding her went the wrong direction entirely. He almost laughed. "Let me think about it," Daniel said. "How long do you need?" "A week." "You have a week," Elias said. "Call me Thursday." Daniel hung up. He sat in the car watching his daughter run. He thought about Howard Greer, about Dorothy Simmons' letter with the blue flowers on the stationery, about how many hospitals existed in the state of Ohio alone, and how many of them had a Gerald Fitch making resource allocation decisions in the language of operational efficiency, and how many of them had an Emily Carter somewhere on the floor fighting those decisions from the inside with nothing but her own persistence and the knowledge of what was right. He thought about the gap between what institutions said they were and what they actually did when no one important was watching. He thought about the specific value of being unimportant, of being the man nobody watched because they decided he didn't matter, of what you could see from that position that you couldn't see from any other. He got out of the car. He walked to the sideline of the soccer field. Lily saw him and waved without breaking stride, which was exactly right, acknowledging him without losing focus on the thing she was in the middle of, which was the correct set of priorities. He watched the rest of the game from the sideline in the cool Ohio morning with his hands in his pockets, and the question sitting in the back of his mind in the patient way of something that already knows its answer. He called Elias on Thursday. He said yes. What followed was the hardest 6 months of professional work Daniel had done since the early years of his career, when everything was still being built for the first time, and the building required a kind of sustained total effort that only the young or the deeply motivated could sustain without breaking. He was no longer young. He built the investigative unit from nothing. He wrote the methodology. He designed the training program for the investigators who would go into hospitals the way he'd gone into Green Valley, not as inspectors with clipboards, not as executives with authority, but as people the institution would ignore. Housekeeping staff, cafeteria workers, parking attendants. The entire invisible infrastructure of a hospital that sees everything and is seen by no one. He hired 8 people for the first cohort. He looked for a specific combination of qualities, clinical or institutional knowledge, that could interpret what they observed. The temperament to sustain extended undercover work without losing perspective, and the particular quality he'd learned to recognize over years of hiring the capacity to be treated badly without it making them cruel. The resilience that doesn't harden into cynicism. He found them in unexpected places. A former ER nurse who had left clinical work after a burnout year and was looking for a way back into healthcare advocacy without returning to the floor. A healthcare administrator who had quit his hospital job and written an anonymous blog about institutional failures that had been read by 40,000 people before he took it down. A retired social worker with 30 years of experience in hospital discharge planning, who had, in her words, seen too many people fall through too many gaps and was tired of writing reports about it. He found a young man named Carlos, who had grown up in the kind of neighborhood that produced people who knew exactly what it felt like to walk into a hospital and be made to feel like a problem rather than a patient. Carlos had no clinical background. He had 2 years of community organizing experience and the specific gift of being someone that other people opened up to without fully understanding why. Daniel hired Carlos first. The training program ran 6 weeks. Intensive. Daniel ran much of it himself, which he hadn't entirely planned, but which turned out to be right. There was no substitute for the person who had done it once, explaining it to the people who were about to do it for the first time. He talked about what to watch for. The differential in how people were greeted at registration based on how they presented. The language used in family waiting areas. The timing of responses to call lights. The way a busy nurse's station handled a patient who was poor and alone versus a patient who was wealthy and had family members actively advocating. The small systemic signals that accumulated over days into a picture of an institution's actual values versus its stated ones. He talked about the hardest part. There will be moments, he told them in the last week of training, standing in front of 8 people who were about to do something they couldn't fully prepare for, no matter how thorough the training was. When you see something happening, and every instinct in you says to act, to intervene, to step out of the role. He paused. And you will have to make a judgment call in real time about whether this is a moment for the mission, or a moment for the human being in the room. Carlos raised his hand. How do you know which is which? Daniel thought about Thomas Greer on the floor of the hallway. About Roy in the family waiting room for 6 hours. About the line between observation and abandonment. Ask yourself one question, Daniel said. Is this person going to be okay in the time it takes me to handle it the official way? He looked around the room. If the answer is yes, you hold. If the answer is no, you act. And then you document what you did and why, and you don't apologize for it. He paused. No protocol is worth a life, he said. Remember who we're doing this for, always. The first cohort deployed across 5 Ohio hospitals in the spring. Different regions, different sizes, different demographics. The unit's existence was not publicly announced. Institutional knowledge of the program would defeat the purpose. The Health Oversight Board knew. The legislature's committee knew. The hospitals did not. Daniel ran the operation from an office in Columbus that was small and deliberately not impressive, which he'd insisted on when the committee offered him a larger space. He didn't want impressive. He wanted functional. He wanted a place where the work got done. He was at his desk on a Tuesday morning reading the preliminary field notes from the investigator placed at a hospital in Youngstown when his phone rang. Emily Carter. He answered immediately. I need your advice, she said. Talk to me. She had been the patient advocate at Green Valley for 4 months. In 4 months, she had filed 23 formal escalations cases where patient care had fallen below the standards set by the new protocols, where her authority to escalate to board level had been the only thing standing between a patient and the wrong outcome. 23. That's a lot, Daniel said when she told him. Is it? She didn't say it defensively. She said it the way a person asks a question when they genuinely don't know the benchmark. It's honest, Daniel said. The question isn't whether 23 is too many. The question is whether the escalations are producing outcomes. 20 of 23 have resulted in care modifications that the reviewing physician signed off on, Emily said. 2 are still open. One was bad, Daniel. He heard it in her voice, the weight of the one. Tell me. She told him. A patient 68 admitted for a respiratory issue flagged by Emily for an additional pulmonary consult that the attending had declined to order. Emily had escalated. The board-level process had taken 48 hours. In those 48 hours, the patient's condition had deteriorated in a way that the additional consult might have identified earlier. The patient had survived, was recovering, but the 48 hours had mattered. It's the process, Emily said. The escalation process is right. The protections are right. But 48 hours for a board review is too long when someone is deteriorating. What do you want to do about it? Daniel asked. I want to change the timeline, Emily said. I want an emergency escalation pathway for time-sensitive cases that bypasses the 48-hour review and goes straight to a designated board member on call. She paused. I've drafted the proposal. I need to know if it's defensible. Read it to me, Daniel said. She read it. It was good. Clear, specific, with built-in protections against overuse, and a defined set of criteria for what constituted time-sensitive. The kind of proposal that someone writes when they've thought about a problem from every angle and then committed to the solution without hedging. It's defensible, Daniel said. It's more than defensible. It's right. He paused. Present it to the board yourself. Don't send it through an intermediary. You sit in that room and you make the case the way you made the case in the hallway for Marcus Webb. A beat. I'm not the same person I was in that hallway, Emily said. No, Daniel agreed. You're better. Go make the case. She presented to the board the following week. Daniel knew because Okafor texted him afterward. Your person was in here today. Motion passed unanimously. Emergency escalation pathway goes live in 30 days. And then after a pause, a second text. Text, she's extraordinary. Daniel typed back, I know. He put the phone down. He thought about an 8-year-old girl pushing a mop cart through a hospital corridor in his imagination, which he recognized immediately as something Claire would have laughed at the particular way his brain constructed scenes. It hadn't witnessed always with Lily at the center, because Lily was the center. He thought about what he wanted Lily to understand about the world she was growing up into. Not the polished version. Not the version where institutions always worked, and systems always protected, and people in authority always used it well. She was 8, not 5. She was already old enough to be building her picture of how things actually operated, and he would rather she build it on something true than something comfortable. He thought about what the true version was. The true version was this: most places most of the time were trying. Most people in most institutions were making genuine efforts to do right within the constraints they understood. And also, simultaneously, without contradiction, systems developed gaps, and people fell into them, and the gaps were invisible to everyone, except the people falling into them, and the people the system had decided not to watch. And the work, the ongoing, unglamorous document. Everything fight the protocol, stay in the hallway work, was the process of making the gaps visible, so they could be closed. So the next person who walked through those particular doors without money or without family, or without the knowledge of how to advocate for themselves in a language the system understood, would not fall through. That was the work. He was still in it. On a Wednesday morning in October, 8 months after Daniel had first walked into Green Valley Regional Hospital with a mop bucket and a gray uniform and a 47-page notebook waiting to be filled, he got a call from the hospital. Not from Okafor. Not from Emily or Wilson or Huang. From the main reception line. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Brooks. A young voice, uncertain. Not a professional who dealt with difficult calls regularly. Someone calling because they'd been asked to and weren't sure what happened next. Yes, Daniel said. My name is Jason. I work at the reception desk at Green Valley Regional. I'm calling because, a pause, a shuffle, the sound of someone looking at a note. Because a patient asked us to call you. Her name is Dorothy Simmons. She's back in the hospital, fractured her other hip. A pause. She says she wants to talk to the man who made her feel like a person. Daniel was very still for a moment. Then, is she okay? She's stable, Jason said. She's kind of telling everyone what to do, so I think she's fine." Daniel almost laughed. Actually laughed this time. A real one. "Tell her I'll be there this afternoon," he said. He was there at 2 o'clock. Dorothy Simmons was in a room on the 4th floor, which was a different floor than the one Daniel had ever cleaned in the hospital. He had watched transform from a place he documented to a place he believed in, not perfectly, not completely, but genuinely, the way you believe in things that are in the process of becoming better and have not yet arrived, but are moving. She was smaller than he'd imagined from her letter. Compact, alert, with silver hair cut short, and eyes that took in the room in the particular way of someone who has learned over 74 years to notice things. She looked at him when he came in. At the suit because he was wearing the suit today, the navy blue one, because he had a presentation to the legislative committee at 4 and had not changed yet. "You don't look like a janitor," she said. "I was for a while," he said. He sat down in the chair beside her bed. "How's the hip?" "Horrible," she said. "The first one was bad enough. Now I have a matched set." She studied him. "You're the one who did all that, the investigation." "Yes. I wrote that letter before I knew about any of that," she said. "I wrote it because something was different, and I couldn't explain why, and I wanted to say it to someone." "I read it," Daniel said. She looked at him steadily, the look of a woman evaluating something. "You came because I asked." "I came because you asked. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said. "You were in that letter, Dorothy. Not a complaint, not a demand. Just you noticed something changed, and you wanted whoever was responsible to know that it mattered." He paused. "I needed to meet the person who wrote that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "My husband was in a hospital," she said. 15 years ago. He had insurance. We had good insurance, but he was black, and he was 60, and he was not the kind of man who made people nervous on purpose, but sometimes men like him just made people nervous for no reason they could explain, and I watched how he was treated, and it made me afraid." She paused. "It made me afraid of hospitals for 15 years, even when I needed them." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "And then I came in here and something was different," she said. "Not perfect. I'm not naive. I've been alive too long for perfect, but different." She looked at him. "Who taught you that? That people need to feel seen in order to feel safe?" Daniel thought about Claire. About the way she could walk into any room and make the most uncertain person in it feel like they'd been specifically waited for. About the way Lily had put her hand on his on a Sunday morning without saying a word. "Someone who understood people better than I did," he said. Dorothy nodded slowly, like that was the answer she'd expected. "Well," she said, "tell her she did a good job." "She's gone," Daniel said simply. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. The look of a woman who has also lost people and knows what that sentence costs. "Then carry it for her," she said. The room was quiet. Then Dorothy reached over to the small table beside her bed and picked up a folded piece of paper. "I wrote another letter," she said, "while I was waiting for you to get here. Not to the newspaper this time." She held it out. "For you." He took it. He didn't open it in front of her. He put it in his breast pocket. "I'll read it tonight," he said. "Read it when you need it," she said. "Not tonight specifically. Just when you need to remember why you're doing what you're doing." She settled back against her pillow with the dignity of a woman who has said exactly what she intended to say. "Now go to your meeting. You look like a man who's late for something." He was slightly. He stood. He looked at her for a moment. Dorothy Simmons, 74, in a hospital bed for the second time in 8 months, sharp-eyed and clear-voiced and entirely present. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For writing the first letter," he said. "For noticing. A lot of people go through their lives in institutions that aren't treating them right, and they never say anything about it, because they've been taught not to expect anything different." He paused. "You said something that mattered." Dorothy looked at him with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. The particular expression of a person who has lived long enough to know that being told you matter is not the same as believing it, but who is in this moment working on the believing. Go, she said. You're late. He went. He sat in the legislative committee meeting that afternoon and presented the first cohort's preliminary findings with the specificity and precision he'd brought to everything connected to this work. 4 hospitals. 16 weeks of observation across the cohort. Documented patterns across all 4 sites with sufficient variation to suggest that the issues were systemic rather than institution-specific. The committee chair, a woman named Senator Pauline Rhodes, who had been in state politics for 18 years and had the kind of face that had learned to show exactly as much as it chose to show, listened to the entire presentation without interrupting. When Daniel finished, she said, "What do you need?" Daniel had a list prepared. He'd had it prepared for 3 months, refined over 6, ready since before he walked into his first meeting with this committee. 3 pages. Specific. Funded. Defensible. He handed it across the table. She read it. She looked up. "The undercover methodology," she said. "There are people on this committee who are going to push back on that. The hospitals are going to push back. Their lobby is going to argue that this constitutes..." "Senator," Daniel said, "every time a hospital knows it's being inspected, it performs for the inspection. That is not a flaw in the system. That is a rational institutional response to a known external evaluation." He held her gaze. "The patients being served by these hospitals don't get a performance. They get the real version. The only way to evaluate the real version is to be in it without announcing yourself." He paused. Howard Greer didn't know he was in an underrepresented triage scenario. Dorothy Simmons didn't know the first time she walked into Green Valley whether she was going to be treated like a person. They didn't get to prepare. The investigation shouldn't either. Silence. Then Rhodes said, "How many hospitals can your unit cover in year 1? 8 to 12, depending on funding and complexity," Daniel said. "What would full funding look like?" He pointed to page 2 of the 3-page list. She read page 2. She looked at him. "You'll have it," she said. "Not without a fight, but you'll have it." He nodded. She looked at the list again, then at him. "Mr. Brooks," she said. "One more question. Why are you still doing this? You did the thing at Green Valley. You built the unit. You trained the people. You could hand this off to someone and go back to..." She paused. "Whatever the quiet version of your life is." Daniel thought about Dorothy's letter in his breast pocket. About Grace Greer's email. About Thomas Greer's grip in a hallway. About Emily Carter in a boardroom, making the case for a patient she'd never met, but was already fighting for. About Howard Greer, who was always Howard Greer, who would always be the beginning of the answer to that question. Because there are more of them, Daniel said. More hospitals, more gaps, more people walking through doors without insurance cards or family advocates, or the knowledge of how to fight for themselves inside a system that doesn't naturally fight for them. He paused. "And I know how to see the gaps. I know how to be in the room in a way that makes them visible." He looked at the senator steadily. "That's a specific thing to know, and specific things carry specific obligations." Senator Rhodes held his gaze for a moment. Then she closed the folder. "Then let's fund it properly," she said. He drove home in the early evening. The light, that particular shade of October amber that makes Ohio look like a place someone painted rather than a place where things actually happen. He stopped at the grocery store. He bought chicken and rice and the specific brand of apple juice that Lily had decided was the only acceptable apple juice, a position she held, with the conviction of someone who has done extensive research. He got home at 6:15. Lily was at the kitchen table doing homework with the focused unhappiness of someone working on a subject they find unreasonable. "Math," Daniel guessed. "Fractions," she said. The word carried significant weight. "Fractions are fine," he said. "Fractions are not fine," she said. He put the groceries down. He sat across from her. He looked at the problem she was stuck on. "Okay," he said. "Show me where you lost it." She showed him. He walked her through it. Not by doing it for her, by asking the question that made her see the piece she'd been looking past the way you do when you know someone well enough to know exactly where they get stuck and what they need to get unstuck. She got it. She looked at the completed problem with the expression of someone who has been convinced of something against their initial judgment. "That was actually not that bad," she said. "Fractions are fine," he said again. She gave him the look that meant I'm not conceding the larger argument. He made dinner. They ate together at the kitchen table, the table where he had read Margaret's case summary 3 months before he walked into Green Valley for the first time, where he had written his reports, where he had taken Roberta Huang's late-night call, where Grace Greer's email had opened on his screen on a Sunday morning. The table where Lily put her hand on his and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed. After dinner, after dishes, after Lily's reading time, and the negotiation about exactly when reading time ended, that was a nightly performance. They both knew the choreography of after all of it. Daniel sat in the living room. He took out Dorothy Simmons' letter. He unfolded it. It was short. She had written in a clear, deliberate hand, the handwriting of a woman who had been taught that how you write says something about how seriously you take what you're saying. It said, "Mr. Brooks, I've been thinking about what made the difference. Not the policy changes, or the protocols, or the new signs on the walls about patient rights. Those things are good, but they're not the difference. The difference is, this someone decided that the people this hospital had been ignoring were worth seeing. And when one person decides that really decides it, it changes what's possible for everyone around them. You decided that. Don't forget that you decided that. When it's hard, and it will be hard, come back to the deciding. That's where it started. That's where it always starts. Yours truly, Dorothy Simmons." He read it twice. He folded it carefully. He put it back in his breast pocket. He sat in the quiet living room in the house where his daughter was asleep, and where Claire's photograph sat on the small table in the corner, and where the specific accumulated weight of what he had done and was still doing rested on him. The way weight rests on someone who has chosen to carry it, not a burden, not exactly, but a presence. Substantial. Real. The kind of thing you know you're carrying because you feel it, and because you wouldn't put it down if you could. He looked at Claire's photograph. "Dorothy says you did a good job," he said quietly. He sat with that for a moment. Then he got up. He turned off the lights in the living room. He checked the locks. He went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Lily's room, the same ritual, the same child, the same sleeping certainty that the world was basically manageable, and stood there for a long moment. She was growing, he thought. 8 years old was already different from 7 in 100 small ways that he tracked, because he tracked everything. It was who he was, but that he tried not to catalog too aggressively, because some things deserved to just happen rather than be documented. She would grow into a world with gaps in it. That was not going to change. Systems were built by people, and people had limits, and the distance between what an institution declared and what it actually did in the unobserved moment was a gap that would always need closing by someone willing to do the closing. He hoped she would be someone willing to do the closing. He thought she probably would be. She had her mother's eyes, and her mother's terrifying capacity for reading people, and the particular stubborn insistence on honesty that she had gotten from somewhere, and that he sometimes thought was the best thing he had ever managed to give her without quite meaning to. He would do everything in his power to leave her a world with fewer gaps than the one he'd inherited. That was the work. Not just the hospitals, not just the investigative unit, not just the legislative committee or the funding fight, or the 8 people he'd trained and sent into difficult places to see what the system looked like when it thought no one important was watching. All of it was the same work. The same deciding that Dorothy had named in her letter. The decision that the people the system had deemed invisible were worth seeing. He went to bed. He slept without dreaming, the way he'd slept the night before the board meeting, the sleep of someone who has made their decision and is done with the making of it, and ready only for the morning. The work would be there in the morning. The gaps would be there. The people falling into them would be there. And so would Daniel Brooks, not because he was extraordinary, not because he was fearless, not because he had a title, or a credential, or a particular right to the work, but because he had stood in a hallway at 7:14 in the morning with a cleaning cloth in his hand and seen a man go down and not looked away. That was all. That was everything. The man everyone had looked through had turned out to be the only one looking clearly enough to see what needed to change. and he was not done looking.